Skyrim, A Sorcerer's Tale by Rastislav. Chapter 411, Sweet Mother. The house offers congratulations to Job Diff for their most wise ascension above the masses. The wisdom of their act shall only be matched by the expediency of their retirement from the mine's trademark. On a completely unrelated note, you will be happy to know that you have all been allotted an extra serving on today's lunch. General POV. Consciousness returned slowly and in short bursts. His eyes were covered and his mouth gagged. Only his hearing remained as he barely managed to identify the sounds of people talking, boots marching, and a carriage's wheels creaking. A familiar carriage's weight, he soon realized. He tried to squirm and to escape, but he soon found that he lacked his limbs, and he could not even roll his way to freedom as he was still bound even with his newfound disability. Even his meager magic was bound by some infernal contraption. His captors took no chances with his potential escape. Seeing no other way to act, he tried making some noise. At least that way, he may be able to gather some information, but all he received as thanks for making himself known was a pommel to the back of the head and the sweet release of oblivion. Consciousness returned once again. He felt the lack of fresh air on his skin and knew he was no longer on the road. And before he could try and think of a way to get himself out of this situation, he heard voices. Crimson lightning, you say? An unfamiliar voice, resonant, powerful, and yet surprisingly melodious, asked. A familiar one responded, Indeed, my lord, Count Ferontius died in an instant when struck by it. We could do nothing to help him. Cicero's mind raced as he started putting the pieces together. So that's what she meant by he said I better appreciate it. The voice of what he was certain was Raven Dagoth resounded with mirth, sure made taking the city over easier. He scoffs, he'd probably justify it by saying he gave the little rebel a chance as well. I am guessing this is beyond my pay grade. Cicero could practically hear the quotations as the pale elf asked in turn. Yep, Dagoth answered immediately, but we can talk about that later. It would seem our guest has finally decided to grace us with his presence. Cicero wanted to curse his situation, but before he was given even that much dignity, he felt movement behind him, and both his blindfold and gag were removed in an instant by what looked to be a large metal hand, judging by the shadow. He did not bother focusing on that detail, however. The figure currently staring down at him with an appreciatively murderous smile commanded all of his attention at the moment. Ah! Raven Dagoth clapped his hands with false cheer. Cicero, right? I've been looking for you for a while. He leaned in, giving the clown man a full view of his face and threateningly glowing eyes. Almost reflexively, he tried worming his way out. Cicero is sure that this is some big misunderstanding. Before he could so much as twitch, a gauntleted hand grabbed his lower jaw none too gently, Dagoth having appeared in front of him, faster than he could see, now see here, keeper. The elf spoke, his false cheer completely gone. You will not waste any more of my time or else. The clown felt his head being forcefully twisted, even his eyes being made to look in a certain direction as he was made to see the opened coffin of the Night Mother. A small, flat, circular piece of glass ringed with ebony floating above her. Cicero was silent for a moment before he was struck with a wave of religious fury as he began cursing, blaspheming cur. He hissed, You are not worthy to lay your eye. He felt the slap before he heard it, what was left of his body hitting the floor hard alongside the chair he was bound to. Without any sound being made, the massive metal hand grabbed the chair and righted it, the creature behind the clown not even bothering to acknowledge his existence. Shut the fuck up, you nugget. Dagoth scoffed disdainfully. The next time you say something unhelpful, I will burn a bitch. The elf summoned a ball of golden fire far too close to the Night Mother, making it more than evident he was not joking. Once more Cicero felt his anger surging, but he managed to control himself. His duty as keeper took priority over everything else. Very well, he said after a few moments, the truth of his situation ever so slowly sinking in. Cicero will listen. What were you doing in Skingrad? The dark elf asked immediately, the two pale ones behind him looking quite curious as well. Cicero considered just how much he wished to stretch the truth for a moment too long, as Dagoth cut in once again. Know that I will know if you lie. The threat underlining the assurance quite obvious to all. A simple assassination, Cicero assures you. The clown spoke after a moment, his voice carrying a hint of helplessness. The only stipulation was that we not look into anything, simply kill the target and leave. Dagoth rose an eyebrow, obviously knowing something Cicero did not. And who hired you for it? Cicero does not know. The clown would have shrugged if he still had arms for it. He made do with only his shoulders. A proxy was used. Cicero was most confused when the messenger slit her own throat after giving him the full payment up front. The elf frowned, but evidently did hear the truth of the clown's words as he shook his head in annoyance. Cicero has a question. The clown spoke up, feeling bold. Caught slightly off guard, Dagoth just shrugged. Sure. Why hunt down the Brotherhood? The clown asked, keeping his seething fury well and truly masked. Cicero understands that we may be competitors, but there was no need for such animosity. Oh, that? The elf asked with some amusement. I simply do not like you. What? Was all the clown could muster in response. Feeling a bit talkative, Dagoth chose to enlighten him. You were a bunch of murder hobos and a death cult at that. He spread his arms as if that made everything make sense. That and you were hired to kill me, and I can't just forgive that. But why kidnap the Night Mother? Cicero asked, honestly confused. Why go against fate and take the destined listener from her path? Do you not fear the void? The void of death has nothing on the truth. The elf fired back immediately, before frowning. What do you mean by the fated listener? The one you call Dragonborn. Cicero felt no need to conceal anything. The fate of him and his charge were fully in his captor's hands. She was to be the new listener, the rebirth of the Dark Bro. Once more, Cicero could do nothing, as he felt the strike before he heard it, feeling his jaw break, his neck crack, and his spine utterly shatter as his back struck the distant wall, completely destroying the chair it was fastened to. What an absolutely disgusting thought. He barely heard the elf over the ringing in his head scorch. Cicero suddenly felt himself being healed, a great golden bird staring down at him with such disdain the elf's gaze looked downright friendly in comparison. The bird pointedly did not touch him as it healed him, contenting itself with grumbling about wastes of magicka all the while. It took close to a full minute before Cicero turned truly coherent again, the pain now only screaming at him instead of outright deafening him as it did moments prior. Noticing this, Dagoth lit his hand with golden flames again, moving it dangerously close to the Night Mother as the next question came. Tell me, clown, are you the last of your filthy order? Any more disgusting little apprentices running about? Cicero knew what would come next, and yet he could not struggle from his position. In fact, he found he could do nothing at all. An odd scratching sensation began overtaking his mind as he felt himself compelled to speak, and only the truth at that "aye." He struggled to keep the words back, but the scratching intensified manifold, and he could resist no more. Yes, he barked in both desperation and relief as he felt the force stop squeezing his brain. Raven stared down at the clown for a long while, seemingly still present in the room, even as he used every scrying spell he knew to confirm the clown's words. Finally, he gave Cicero a rather warm smile. Good, it would seem you spoke the truth. Without hesitation, Raven snapped his fingers and a massive purple magic circle lit up below the Night Mother, a loud resonating hum filling the air as it was charged with more magicka than most people would interact with in lifetimes. A loud, otherworldly screech of the vaguely feminine variety soon joined the humming noise, as the corpse opened its eyes and tried freeing itself from its current prison. Cicero would have been amazed by the development if he was not currently busy screaming his throat out as he lay every curse he could come up with at the filthy blasphemer. All reason left him as he understood the truth. He would be the final keeper. And yet even as he cursed his host, with each passing moment, he felt the fog ever so slowly lift from his deranged mind, his deeds and actions slowly being twisted from the righteous exaltation they were before, into the filth that they were in truth. But he would not be given time to consider his life choices. He was undeserving of such. It seems that is all I will be getting out of your filthy mouth." Raven Dagoth scoffed as the Night Mother disintegrated and the smoke from her burning ashes surged into the glass circle hanging above her Akulakan. Once more, Cicero felt himself being hoisted without a sound, a pair of large metal hands holding him in a vice and not letting him wriggle an inch. All the clown assassin could do was scream as what looked to be a black soul gem was shoved into his mouth and then ever so slowly pushed into his brain. Raven's POV. Ugh, I hold back the urge to spit on the ground, depositing the filled soul gem onto a nearby table. Finally got them all. I will admit that my inability to find the little shit for years had been a bit grating, but now I could finally pat myself on the back for a job well done. If you are going to make a religious order of assassins, then at least don't make it a bloody death cult. Professionals have standards. To think I would once more stand before the making of history. Anandor spoke with genuine warmth in his tone, drawing me from my thoughts. The world is brighter without the void's messenger. The void is not so easily rid of, I told him after a moment's consideration, shaking my head as I did. I doubt this will be the last we saw of Sithis and its ilk, but we have certainly struck a blow. Never doubt that. The two of us shared a nod and were probably going to continue yapping, but Arlo's surprised exclamation, a dark and distinctly malevolent wisp of smoke, leaving his stump as he immediately downed a regeneration potion, his missing arm rapidly growing out as his robes followed after it, the wound disappearing as if it were never there. Lucky. I whistle. I thought we would need to make some contraption to replace your arm with how cursed the wound was, but I suppose removing the source of it works too. I, of course, was lying, but looking at Aelor's startled expression was definitely worth it as he blanched. Maybe it would be wise to see if the enchantment process went well. Arlor makes a poor attempt at changing the topic. We wouldn't want any instabilities happening, right? Lucky him that I preferred good loot to trolling him. With a pep in my step, I approached the now empty sarcophagus, the Night Mother missing in her rotten entirety as even the ashes were consumed in the enchanting process. Without a care in the world, I stopped the temporary levitation ward and pulled the piece of glass into my hand. The tiny little thing absolutely bursting with barley-contained power, an ominous air surrounding it imperceptibly. One would not need a grand mental capacity to realize what I was currently holding was a monocle, and a rather finely made one at that, with a band of ebony glowing with tiny purple etchings, while the glass was not in fact glass anymore, but a swirling see-through shadow. You see, when Aelor first returned with his band, I spent a good chunk of the day considering the implications of using the Void's messenger for something. But then I realized I've already done more than enough to offend dear Ola Sithis, and if he was going to come for me, he would have done so ages ago. And the Night Mother was far, far too useful to just ignore as a potential ingredient in my work. Part of me was quite tempted to just go balls to the wall and listen to Scorch's suggestion and just make some mad death sticks. But the Night Mother's prophetic capabilities were too useful to waste on something so wasteful, if admittedly quite funny. No, instead of doing that, I chose to make a tool. A perfect aid to murdering the shit out of someone or something when the need arose. I admit the monocle was a suboptimal choice, as her powers were more directed at speaking to her listeners. But quite frankly, I preferred not having shadowy murderous voices invading my mind while I was trying to kill something. And so I came up with a rather dignified alternative, if I did say so myself. Void's blink. Even while chained, the Void desires to slay and destroy all. Reveals the weakest points, anything from physical to outright conceptual, granting the bearer the chance to strike down anything with enough preparation. I could not help but smirk as I attached the monocle to a fine chain and placed it in a new pocket within my robe, fitting it snugly within as its energies settled and awaited further use. One more step toward ensuring ultimate victory. Chapter 412 of Swift Returns and Stately Visits. Raven's POV. Just around half a day and a half after I had disposed of the murder hobo filth, a bit after midnight to be more exact, I found myself standing atop the white gold tower alongside a trio of other figures. The view was downright immaculate, even with the almost complete lack of lighting, though I doubted my current companions could appreciate it, as Titus kept fidgeting about in irritation. "And when do you plan on sharing your reason for calling us up here?" the good Emperor finally asks. "Some of us do require sleep, Ravin." Both Commander Maro and Battle Mage Caladon look equally as curious, though the mage's gaze is far more reserved than the bodyguard's. My relaxed expression shifts from my usual relaxed self to being deathly serious as I spoke in a completely flat tone. "I have decided to usurp your empire, bow before your new overlord mortals, and I will permit you to continue living as my slaves." Caladon raises a confused eyebrow, Maro frowns, and Titus just scoffs. "As if you could ever be bothered." I let out a tisk at his lack of reaction. "Ruin all my fun. Why don't you?" The old fart chuckles as his advisors look on, confused as to how to react. They are not given enough time to truly consider it, however, as the surprisingly silent flaps of two large wings cut into the air to our west, a great crimson blur practically flashing into existence as the massive form of a dragon promptly parked atop the great tower without so much as a thud. The tower was large enough to hold 5 larger dragons atop it comfortably, so there were no issues with spacing. "Ah!" I hear the realization in Titus's voice as he looks on in wonder, his battle mage joining him as poor Maro helplessly clutched at the hilt of his sword, knowing damn well he was utterly useless in this kind of situation and hating every moment of it. "Odaviing," I give the Dover a nod. "Sarot Falil." His voice rumbles out. "Your might grows." "Why, thank you." I bow dramatically and look up to the figure jumping off the dragon's back and down his side with practiced ease. Much to my amusement, Minthara's armored form somehow makes more noise as her boots hit the stone below us, an unfamiliar mask covering her expression as she looked up to us. Well, I say it was unfamiliar, but that is mostly because I haven't exactly seen it in this life specifically. I had no reason not to give her all the dragon priest masks I've gathered, and it really didn't take her much effort to hunt down any we missed once we were done with Alduin. Turns out the bastards drew their lichdom from the big black and dead all this while, and killing them now was insultingly easy. Anyway, to make a long story slightly less long, she managed to get her hands on Konarek and had it dyed to fit in with her silvery steel armor, while refitting her helmet and effectively just turning the mask into a visor. That she told me through the orb trademark, the bloody thing, let her slowly start practicing real actual time magic as it corrected any minor mistakes and slowly let her optimize it, nearly made me break something, as all the other masks were, and pardon my old Mary here, utter shit. She did promise to teach me when she mastered it, so it isn't like I was too salty about it. Now some may go, "Oh, but Raven, isn't that her heritage? Aren't you abusing your relationship just to expand your power?" You see, that would sound reasonable, if it didn't also sound like something someone without the chance to learn time magic would say. My musings are cut off abruptly as she lifts her helmet off and greets us all with a cheerful smile, looking far more relaxed than she was before she left the city. "Apologies for being late," she says to the trio, mostly to Titus. "I got stuck in a bit of adventuring." "Quite." Titus scoffs, still staring at Odaviing in awe. "I trust that your adventuring," he says with some amusement and a chuckle, "will not come back to bite us in our proverbial collective rears soon enough." "No one was left to report on us," she fires off without skipping a beat. That Maro nodded sagely at that actually made me respect the man more, oddly enough. Titus's shoulders slump slightly as he mutters, "I suppose that is the best I am getting, isn't it?" Ignoring the grumbling old fart, she turns to me with her cheer renewed. "Had fun?" I ask with a smirk. She looks like she wants to tell me all about it, but holds herself back as she turns to her erstwhile mount. "Thank you for bringing me here. You can return to your brothers now." Odaviing doesn't seem bothered by the dismissal as he inclines his massive head, Thuri, and takes off with a whispered string of Thu'um, throwing him into the air and beyond the sight of the weak. "Magnificent," I hear Caladon mutter to himself. Now free of her vassal's imposing presence, Minthara ignored the trio of observers as she gave me a quick hug. not terribly comfortable due to the armor, but still warm in its intent. Titus cleared his throat and looked at her with a raised eyebrow, but at this point she had slowly grown inured to such teasing and merely raised an eyebrow of her own in turn. I see none of us will be getting much information this evening, so I will be going back to sleep now. Chuckling, the old emperor shook his head and spoke. Be sure to arrive on time tomorrow. Having you present to greet the Alinori delegation will ensure we speak from a position of strength. He waits just long enough for her to nod before adding, and of course, we will be discussing your decision to go gallivanting off into foreign territory, young lady. She goes to protest, but Titus does not hesitate and strikes the final blow. The Lady Valena was devastated when she heard you joined Julius's little expedition. He sighs, in defeat. Why she may even force me to have you join her for some lectures in diplomacy once more. Minthara, whose once good cheer was ever so swiftly replaced with dread, failed to hold back a gulp of fear at the mention of her etiquette teacher. Do enjoy your evening. Titus fired off a final shot with a wink as he quickly led his entourage away before the literal demigod managed to get over her light trauma. It took her a few seconds after they left, but when she realized what Titus had done, all she could do was pout. There. I chuckle as I pat her on the shoulder. I won't let the scary seneschal hurt you. My savior. She sniffs dramatically, and we both share a chuckle. One teleport later, we were back in my mansion, the protections and wards of the city thoroughly failing to hold my skill at space magic back, as I didn't merely break through them, but blatantly went around them, not even so much as disturbing a wisp of magicka as I did. Akulakan gave me a light bow as he left to guard the door outside my study, and I summoned an ornate barrel of my newest growing addiction, pouring 2 crystal glasses enchanted to chill their contents, full of the sweet wine Hasildor had gifted me. Wine? Minthara rose an eyebrow. You know I don't particularly enjoy drinking it. Just take a sip and tell me what you think, I answer knowingly. Not willing to be stubborn about something so small, she does as asked, and I see her eyebrow raise as the taste struck her, sweet like mead. She comments, my thoughts exactly. I grin back. It was a gift from a family friend, you could say. The vampire? She raises an eyebrow. The vampire. I nod. She takes another sip without thinking. Now that I think about it, you know an awful lot of those. I shrug. Not my fault. Most people need hundreds of years to become powerful enough to be worth knowing. Her hand pauses mid yet another sip. I knew she'd enjoy it, as she blinks in surprise. I fully expected you to lament how they are some of the rare people who won't just die of old age. She tilts her head. This feels far more reasonable. I mean, yeah, sure. I shrug and give her a pointed look. I just didn't want to ruin the mood by discussing the mortality of our friends and vassals. Her cheeks take on a slightly rosy hue as she looks down in light embarrassment. Sorry. Rolling my eyes, I wave it off. Not the first time your foot ended up in your mouth. Her embarrassment grows by an order of magnitude. I naturally do not desist and give her my sweetest smile. Don't worry though, it is quite adorable. She makes a noise that is something between a boiling kettle and an undignified squeak before practically slamming her now empty glass atop my table. Right, when is the Dragon Banner scheduled to return? It would have been quite a good change of topic if her face was not currently a burning red, that is. Still, I was as always magnanimous in victory, and thus I showed mercy. We spent the late night and early morning relaxing as I regaled her of our political advancements, and she told me of summoned sandstorms, freshly inspired forebear Redguard allies, of ruined Old Mary fortifications and outposts, and a rising fanaticism among those troops that accompanied her west. Needless to say, we both derived great enjoyment from our silent yet inevitable victory. In the words of a certain immaterial soul tumor I hoped I would never meet, everything was going just as planned. The following day found us both in the grand throne room of white gold, Anondor standing to my side, while the recently returned Skirnir accompanied Minthara, both of us positioned in our previous spots in the seats of honor as we awaited the city's most recent visitors to make their way to us. The chamber of the Elder Council was not occupied solely by us either. as multiple high nobles and their entourages made sure to attend today's events. A good number of them not even bothering to live in their actual domains and delegating most of their work to a loyal steward while they enjoyed the high life in the capital. Honestly, so long as the stewards did their jobs well, I couldn't even be bothered to be offended by this. They were only mortals, and for all they knew, this was all the life they would ever get. I could feel Scorch's burning gaze from within, but I knew I wasn't being an arrogant cunt in this case. Perspective made fools of all of us, and expecting everyone to be as enlightened as I was just plain idiocy. Naturally, the dreaded Birdman didn't care one whit for that and kept giving me his glare of judgment for a good hour after that. Eternally inflamed poultry aside, many familiar faces were gathered in the grand chamber. Everyone from the entirety of Titus's personal council and his greatest loyalists present in the capital or their representatives. Anvil, Bravil, Bruma, recently joined by Leowin, and to everyone's grand surprise, Skingrad, made for a rather strong core for our newly empowered grip on the heartland. The rest was occupied by the rulers and representatives of the by now thoroughly pacified nobility of the other holdings, all of them ever so slightly consolidated under the soft leadership of one Vitellius Tor, even if the fat count knew damn well how any kind of attempt at gathering further power would end. Why we even had such grand examples as Leowin and Skingrad to serve as warning to anyone trying to get funny and step out of line. The fat man seemingly noticed my subtle gaze and inclined his head, the fact that my head barely even moved in his direction for this to happen not bothering me whatsoever. I could always appreciate a showing of skill, no matter how annoying the one with said skill was. My observations were ended prematurely as the great doors of the chamber were swung open by the Penitus Oculatus guards, and a master of ceremonies began announcing the titles of the dozen or so Alinori nobles who deigned to grace us with their presence. But I did not care overmuch for most of them, only a certain duo drawing my eyes as I beheld Kinlord Narcissus, and to my surprise his daughter, the self-same powerful mage who joined Harkon's Volkihar in their ambush all the way back then. Narcissus looked tired, and I didn't mean he was tired from the road. There was a certain air of exhaustion surrounding the mer as he tried hiding it from me with downright immaculate posture and self-control. His daughter, however, well, she was currently staring at me with what I could only describe as the gaze of a schoolgirl trying and failing to hide her crush. Huh. So that was a thing. Chapter 4. 113. Alinori Delegation. General POV. The chamber of the Ruby Throne turns mostly silent, save for a few whispers here and there between the Heartlander nobility. Most of them stared at the elven delegation with the usual calculative gazes natural to the majority of those in power. Some looked downright bored, presuming to know how everything would turn out in the end, while only a pair held outright hostility in their eyes. Emperor Titus, on the other hand, was incredibly relaxed considering the situation. "Ah, Lord Nares," he spoke softly, "we have been expecting you for some time now." "Kinlord," Narcissus corrects to a complete and utter lack of reaction from the ruler of Tamriel. "And our arrival is only natural. Your own actions did force our hand." "Force?" Titus rose an eyebrow. "I force you to do nothing, my good man." The elf showed no reaction to being called a man, but those of a greater perception would notice his lips thinning ever so slightly. Titus, naturally, went on without a care. "The agents of your people have acted unlawfully within my own territory, and the very beating heart of it at that." He barely raises his voice, but his shifting demeanor is more than enough to bring forth his true gravitas, as he simply straightens atop his throne. "I cannot be expected to leave such things unanswered, now can I?" A good number of the gathered nobility grumbled in agreement, most of them falsely. Narcissus's eyes sharpen. "Agents that have yet to be expatriated for proper judgment, as you well know." Titus merely gave him a blank look. They resisted arrest. Accepting the answer just a bit too quickly, the elf nodded. "As you say. However, I am not here to discuss the rightness of your decisions against the agents of my people's current government." The tinge of disdain in his voice had one of his fellow dignitaries looking downright scandalized. Instead, I wish to renegotiate your rather brash, he settled on the word after a brief pause, decision to outright embargo all trade between our two nations. Titus nodded along amiably. Internal security is very important for running an empire, as one of your station is no doubt aware. The old emperor somehow manages to sound both respectful and patronizing at the same time. Permitting traffic, no matter how profitable, of such a scale to continue while acts of rampant sabotage abound is simply not acceptable to any self-respecting ruler. And I do not expect you to, Emperor Mede. Narcissus catches on. However, I am sure that certain amendments can be made to ensure both sides are satisfied. Even your own traders suffer needlessly at the loss of access to such a large market. To remain over-firm would do neither of our peoples any good. I am, of course, open to negotiations. Titus's smile was not a pretty one. Beginning with restitutions, of course. Narcissus didn't quite twitch, but it was a close thing, of course. However, I would be a poor host if I forced such a discussion on you without allowing you a few hours to convalesce. The Emperor finally got to the meat of things. We would be delighted if you and your fellows would join us for a brief meal. The elf was no idiot and knew what the Emperor was hinting at, simply nodding in response without even bothering to consult his colleagues about it. The imperial nobles, however, were far less happy. Only a few were quite inept enough to not realize Titus had just blatantly circumvented the Elder Council and decided to hold such important negotiations with only his inner council permitted to attend. None spoke up, however, one look from the resident dark elf swiftly reminding them of the visits all of them received in the past few evenings. People always say coin is the best social lubricant. Raven thought with amusement as he watched a few of the Elder Council members attempt to hide their fuming. They obviously never tried mass blackmail. Raven's POV. We all shuffled into Titus's own council chambers a few minutes later, most of the elven delegation looking increasingly uncomfortable as they walked deeper and deeper into the very heart of the empire. None held any illusions about their chances if things turned sour. Narcissus, however, held his head high, his daughter doing a fair job at mimicking him, at least somewhat, as they were shown into the large chamber and were actually welcomed by a genuine banquet. Titus sat at the head of the table without any fanfare, quickly joined by myself, Minthara, and the rest of his council, save for Alakim, who was still working his arse off in Leowin. The Alinori hesitated only briefly before their leader followed Titus's example and chose to pretend everything was perfectly in order, ever so slowly diffusing the situation as the air calmed somewhat. There were some attempts by his fellow diplomats to begin talks, but all of their requests were met by Titus, requesting they enjoy the food and drink first, which even with all their almost inborn disdain, the group of Altma readily accepted. An imperial banquet was not something one got to experience all that often, even if one counted themselves amongst the highest nobility of Alinor. About 20 or so minutes later, the tension in the room reduced enough for some small talk to begin. The diplomats knew of the councillors, and Titus's advisors knew of most of them. Francis Villers wasted no time in probing some of them about the current state of Alinor with almost disturbing proficiency. The kleptomaniac Breton managing to get a few words out here and there that swiftly had me gathering a rather clear picture of what was going on as the banquet went on. The imperial seneschal was ran quite ragged in keeping him from making any outright deals, however. Narcissus's hidden glowering at his subordinates was palpable, and no doubt deciding to distract himself, he turned to me. Lord Dagoth, it has been some time since we last met. That it has. I nod, my smile genuinely amiable, if a bit slight. Our previous business has concluded rather productively the last time. Here is to hoping today will end the same. He did not seem to share in my enthusiasm, but still nodded as politely as he could. So, I went on, my smile replaced with a smirk, are your guilds truly so dependent on raw resources that a simple embargo has managed to shake them this much? Another diplomat, the same one I got that little tidbit off, winces as he realizes what happened. The industries of Alinor are as robust as they are storied. The Kinlord answers calmly, at least on the surface. However, one must always see to their people's best interest. I just stare at him blankly for a long while, my eyebrow rising with deliberate slowness. Damn it all, yes. He sighs. I grin. That is what I thought. Narcissus just keeps glowering internally. It is a matter of scale. Adapting productivity to changes in trade is never a simple affair, especially when the cutoff is so sudden. And let me guess, Minthara interjects, sounding just a tiny bit too enthused by the whole thing. Your masters were too proud to come themselves and saddled you with the job. He gives her a considering look for only a moment and speaks. The Dominion is a rather prideful leviathan. To admit weakness before those they perceive as lesser is utterly unacceptable to them. Minthara quirks an eyebrow, drawing the attention of Nerys, who had been trying and failing to come up with a reason to insert herself into the conversation for a while now. You speak as if you are not one of them. How refreshing. Not all of us from Alinor are Thalmor, young godling. The title was not used in praise and was instead a statement of fact. Most of us still hold our loyalty to the murdered Aranas far too tightly to serve their murderers outright, but I am as ever a servant of my homeland. Yes, the only reason they even fought in the First War was the temptation of freeing themselves from imperial oppression. I cut in with a lazy hand wave. A rather prideful bunch, our distant cousins. His eyes shifted to me for a moment before turning back to Minthara. As crudely as Lord Dagoth put it, he is not incorrect. The Thalmor are but a political bloc whose influence simply encompasses so much, they may as well count as our central governing body, now that the line of kings has been cut down. A rather useful distinction, that. Minthara held back a snort of disdain, seeing as it neatly lets you present yourselves as an Alinori delegation instead as one of the Dominion itself. Alinor is but one constituent of the Dominion, Narcissus says flatly. The distinction is quite a real one, I assure you. Nerys finally decides to speak up. Father, are you certain it is wise to speak of such matters so openly? Why wouldn't it be? He raises an eyebrow at her. There are no Thalmor here. He leans in. Are there? She pales slightly as her shoulders sag a bit. No, of course not. Minthara does not hold back a snort this time, drawing an immediate glower from the Altmer mage. Lady Nerys. I decide to interject and save her the embarrassment. Fancy meeting you here. Her expression immediately brightens, and I am delighted to meet you again as well. The wording choice was rather obvious, but I was frankly not moved in the slightest. My presence is indeed a thing of awe. I say only somewhat dryly, though I did not think you would be allowed to participate, what with your previous entanglements. My daughter was in need of some additional perspective in her life. Narcissus interjects before she can answer my well-hidden sarcasm. Acting as an observer to a diplomatic mission is always a useful experience. She once more shrunk at the admonishment. Speaking of roles, the Killard goes on. What exactly are the two of you doing in such a meeting? With all due respect, of course. Why, I am slowly taking over the Empire by controlling the minds of everyone present with my scary dragon powers. Minthara answered blandly. It is going quite well so far. Titus, seeing the opportunity presented, pretends to pale slightly as he hears her speak. And out of the corner of my eye, I notice one of the silent diplomats perk up at this terrible discovery. No doubt already preparing to report all of it to a certain group of asshats. Just as planned, of course. How truly droll. Narcissus drawls, we will be certain to attend the coronation. He pretended to take it as a joke, but one did not need great levels of education to know what a dragonborn represented. The mere fact Minthara was constantly around the supposedly heirless emperor was indication enough about what was truly going on. Everyone knew about it, or so they told themselves. Some more small talk was had as other conversations around us picked up and died down, and a few dozen more minutes later, I found myself sharing hushed whispers with Minthara and then with Titus and Juculus, a rapid scheme forming between all of us. A scheme which signaled the reopening of the actual negotiations now that the banquet excuse had been exhausted. More of the same talk from the throne room was had only in greater detail, with propositions and amendments from both sides, but no agreement as of yet. The Alinori were willing to go quite far to reopen trade, but Titus kept finding more and more obtuse reasons to refuse their proposals. Finally, just as Narcissus looked ready to tell him to go and shove it where Ariel does not gaze, the emperor spoke. After thorough consideration, he closed his eyes as if he was forcing himself to speak further. I will accept your proposal for heavily controlled trade in the city of Anvil, as Leowin is yet unavailable due to pending investigations and large public works. Some of the Altmer looked relieved, but their reactions were premature. The tariffs will be set to 1/3, however. Titus spoke with finality. It is the lowest I am willing to go as things are right now. Narcissus looked genuinely disgruntled, but nodded. And one final stipulation. The Emperor's voice grew grave. The Kinlord prepared himself, yes. This trade deal will officially and openly be one between those cities aligned with yourself and your other fellow Alinori. The Dominion will be getting no such privileges. The old coot was obviously holding back a vicious smirk right now. I see you are already hesitating, so let me sweeten the deal and the tariff to a flat 30%. I am quite generous after all. Narcissus looked like he had just swallowed a lemon, the rest of his fellow diplomats looking something between outraged and downright terrified. Sadly for them, their economy's dependence on the wider market was far too great to refuse the deal. Most elven and especially high elven goods relied on their remarkable master-crafted quality to be sold at outrageous prices outside their island to make a true profit, and removing that from the equation would bankrupt hundreds of businesses in mere months. They all relied on having family savings and investing in their work for centuries at a time, and with their generally high living standards and the high prices of their homeland, the current state of things would start a massive cascade after only a few months, which would lead to a good chunk of their population straight into the embrace of poverty. And while it may seem wise to just let them set their island on fire, a destitute population is an easily indoctrinated one, and the Thalmor would be practically bursting with new recruits whenever the inevitable war broke out. And our guests knew this as well, as for the first time, the entire delegation retreated to a nearby room and set up a temporary ward to discuss between themselves, the rest of us merely contenting ourselves to waiting in silence as we waited for the inevitable response. They thought they escaped Talos's shenanigans when they rebelled. How foolish. Slowly, yet oh so inevitably, the delegation returned, most of them looking pale, while Narcissus looked like the grave as he spoke. We accept your terms. Titus beamed, excellent. I am certain our peoples will inevitably prosper from our renewed ties. Yes. The Kinlord's lips thinned. Now, if you will excuse us, we will need to return to our accommodations. The road was exhausting, and I am sure you are able to delay your elder council from lynching you if you make them wait a while. But of course. Titus smiled genially. Take all the rest you need. The elves picked themselves up and marched out without a word further. Titus chuckled loudly and definitely not evilly. That ought to distract them for a while at least. The councillors voiced their agreement and soon began dispersing. I did like Narcissus somewhat, so my next words did not surprise me all that much. What a shame. Minthara gives me a confused look. What is? Adding just a bit of regret to my voice, I answer simply, we just forced him to sign his own death sentence. She blinks, considers for a moment, and then shrugs. Too bad. Right, I drawl. Speaking of death sentences. She looks at the doorway as if searching for someone. Who exactly was that Neris anyway, besides being his daughter, that is? Without missing a beat, I simply shrug. Just some dumb idiot who got roped into even dumber Thalmor idiocy and thought it a good idea to help the Volkihar ambush me and the Dawn Guard. I tilt my head. She is a pretty talented mage, though, so I suppose there is that. For whatever reason, Minthara now looked at the doorway with pity. Chapter 414. The Good Daedra. There was some annoying grumbling from the vaunted Elder Council when they were told the session was closed for the day, but they couldn't actually do anything about it, so they picked their sorry hides up and left, my friendly looks informing them in no uncertain terms they'd be fucked if they tried anything funny due to this humiliation. Some more words were exchanged with Dukalus, who had seen fit to follow myself and Minthara as we left the White Gold Tower, mostly about plans and my scheduled meeting with Titus tomorrow before I left. Said Imperial Chancellor, seeing Minthara growing more impatient by the second, quickly excused himself and wished us both a fine day. So, she speaks up, sounding rather hesitant. Smirking slightly, I look at her so. Morrowind, huh? She half states, half asks. Quite. I keep smirking. She huffs loudly, completely ignoring the looks and calls directed at us as we marched our way into the Elven Gardens district. Incidentally, the same district the delegation from Alinor was currently staying. Shocker, I know. Prolonged mental tangents aside, the overlady looks none too pleased, seeming downright distraught by the idea under the veneer of annoyance. And how long will you be gone? How should I know? I shrug, much to her chagrin. I am going there to make diplomatic contact, deal with any problems, and ensure they don't try and secede when all that is done. Oh, and I am probably going to see what exactly is happening with the mountain. It has been active for far too long. I know that. She sighs and her shoulders slump. Oh, are you going to miss me? I grab her by the shoulder as we enter the boundaries of my mansion and draw her closer. Her cheeks redden slightly, her growing resistance to embarrassment bringing me further disappointment as she mumbles a quiet yes. I couldn't even tease such an earnest response. Don't worry, I will still be able to visit, you know. I am a rather powerful mage, if I do say so. How very humble. She chuckles. Fine. She goes to say something else, but one of the doors on the way to the more private part of the manor opens and Eldor walks out with an eager look on his face as his eyes meet mine. My lord. He pauses as they then meet Minthara's. The farmer takes one good look at the situation before realizing what was going on and promptly fucking off without a word to do whatever it was he was doing at the moment. I couldn't help but snort, soon followed by Minthara's own noise of amusement. We find our way to my private lounge, and as we finally make ourselves comfortable after a whole day of politicking, she speaks up. Dealing with all the idiots alone is going to be such a pain. You do have Titus's entire network, you know. I point out lazily. Learning to manage that kind of thing is going to be a must if you plan on ruling competently. I'd prefer to just laze about, quite frankly. She pouts. But, I smirk. Your pride would never allow that. The mere idea of it disgusts me to the core. She admits easily. Think of it this way. I try and fail to keep the amusement from my voice. The empire shall be your hoard, the subjects your sheeny coins. She scoffs, though it quickly turns into chuckles. Dragons don't have hoards, you ass. Pretending like the little cuff of my shoulder didn't just threaten to break it, I look down at her imperiously. Dragon that spent hours looting steel swords says what? What? She pauses and frowns before quickly raising her own chin. Those were valuable war supplies. That you sold, I deadpan. That I sold. She admits defeat. For a pittance. I add generously. She just pouts. A few moments of companionable silence pass before she speaks again. Just make sure to write as often as possible. You are the only one here I don't have to tolerate. Your followers will be downright heartbroken to hear that. I snort, and she gives me the, you know that is not what I meant, look. But fine, I will be sure to summon forth the orb trademark whenever possible. Good, she nods, and that was that. Speaking of summoning, I snap my fingers and an official-looking document appears in my hand. Apparently a certain Rosethorn Hall in Skingrad was in the possession of the rebels, and Hasildor helped Aelor to get the deed for me. She looks up at me, curious. Good on you. Deadpanning at her and earning a half-apologetic shrug, I go on. Said hall had once been in the position of a certain Ulrika. I am sure you've heard of her. Now I had her attention, her draconic eyes were practically stuck to the parchment. So I thought why not, and got it for a pittance. I grin and her eyes ever so slowly unstick from the document. before promptly re-sticking to it as I shove it into her face. "It is yours now." A silent moment passes, and then I find myself on my back as a rather hungry dragoness stares down at me. Worth it. Breath light and bones still creaking, I find myself within my study just before the coming of the dawn, slowly hyping myself up for a long planning session that would no doubt be discarded the moment I found something of interest to do in my ancestral homeland, only for my planning session to be completely and utterly derailed as I feel the telltale sign of Daedric vision fuckery. I could naturally never be forced into such things, but considering I felt it coming from a trio of particularly familiar eldritch monstrosities, I let the connection form, and suddenly found myself standing once more in a reflection of moonshadow. Finally, the deep voice of Boethia greets me, the scarred visage of the patron of all Dunmeri warriors, twisting with annoyance. "Don't mind her, dear," Mephala interrupts, the chitin-clad woman cut in with her usual playful tone. "She is simply grumpy when impatient." The scarred Daedra lets out a huff of disdain. "If we were dealing with some mortal, I would have long since stopped bothering with your schemes. You know you love me." Her spideriness titters. "Sisters." Azura's serene voice silences the both of them. "Now is really not the time." Gruff, amused noises of agreement meet her words. "And so the Lady of Dawn and Dusk looks to me after so very long, young Raven Dagoth." She speaks softly. "You have come a long way since you last stood in my realm." Impending apocalypses tend to do that. I shrug with only slight sarcasm in my voice. "Now why exactly have you chosen to call me here? I was going to visit my shrine in a while anyway." "Because you were taking your sweet time." Boethia cuts in without a care. "The world does not wait for you to gallivant with your western kin." "How gracious of you to remind me," I say dryly. But Boethia remains completely unmoved by my retort, instead focusing on what she was truly after. "Now that you are here, what is this I hear about Molag almost losing a limb?" I can already feel the build-up of her power, as she no doubt plans to probe my abilities. Before I can respond in any way, Mephala's titter rejoins us once more. "You already know all that there is to know, dear sister. The rapist and the bitch tried ambushing my chosen, and it did not end well for them." "And the squid," I add wryly. "Can't forget the squid." "Quite." Mephala nods, earning a simple nod from her more destructive counterpart. That Boethia was not at all moved did not surprise me. The whole idea of mortals ascending to godhood through great effort that so separated my own people's views from the Altmer came from her in the first place. If she did react with fear or scheming at my apparent power, she'd be the greatest hypocrite of all. And while she is rather treacherous, the Daedra do not easily abandon parts of themselves. Azura looked distinctly uncomfortable with the situation, though. Her near Athena levels of petty reactions and punishments directed at mortals throughout history made her distinctly aware of just how such things would be received by someone with the power to actually harm her. She wasn't afraid, though. I was nowhere near powerful for that kind of reaction. Yet, someone finally following the Sijic path properly aside. Azura voices, "You have been called here to receive our commandment and be offered your trials. You—" And before I can tell her in no uncertain terms what I think of her setting me up with stupid ass tests, Mephala interrupts. "Azura Tilda, we did not agree to this Tilda." The Lady of Dusk and Dawn gives the webweaver a withering glare, and the two of them promptly switch into some obscure and ancient form of Daedric I could not quite understand, even with my thorough education. Though I could vaguely get the gist of it, with Azura wanting to basically shove a prophecy at me and Mephala going, "Nuh-uh." Boethia looked like she wanted to roll her eyes at the new bout of squabbling before what she perceived was a lesser being, but still let it play out. Part of me honestly thought she was too used to them to even bother anymore. It all goes on for a bit longer than is tolerable, quite frankly. Clearing my throat quite loudly, I somehow managed to draw their attention back to me, my eyes meeting Azura's with a deliberate slowness. "Lady Azura, with all due respect, I do not have the time to deal with your personal brand of vagary." The oh-so-venerable mother of Morrowind looks downright scandalized by her standards anyway. He has you there, Boethia drawls, frankly sounding a bit bored now that potential murder was not the topic. She really just summoned me here to ask about Molag getting shanked and lost interest the moment that was done, didn't she? Mephala disappears from her seat and appears just behind Azura. Come now, dear sister, you agreed, promised even. Should he defeat Bo's champion, we would be doing things my way. We even made a bet of it, Tilda. I hold back my desire to ask what this agreement is, simply filing it with the rest of Mephala's shenanigans that are for whatever bloody reason always in my favor. It would honestly be downright disturbing if it wasn't so bafflingly consistent. Azura doesn't quite sigh, she is too dignified for that, but it is a close thing, very well. She looks up to me, the other two growing silent. Raven Dagoth, we the good Daedra have a request to make of you. The way she forced the request out almost made me laugh out loud. I will certainly hear what you have to say, is what I voice instead. Seemingly reading my feelings, somehow her lip twitches. You are to go to Morrowind. You are to end the squabbling of the houses, help them work together, and walk the first step of a new age of Resdayn. Oh, and do be sure to visit your grandfather. Mephala cuts in with a smirk. Just a passing thought, of course. Was already planning on it. I nod. The webweaver's eyes glint with eagerness, but she does not speak further. Your might will also be needed. Boethia's turn comes, her voice as gruff and serious as ever. The enemies of the Dunmer will not simply watch as your people recover, in fact, they will be rather aggressive in their attempts to stop it. Argonian attacks, got it. I fist my palm lazily. The warrior woman directs a withering glare at me, but it passes over me like so much empty air. Finally, she nods, seeming ever so slightly impressed by my lack of reaction. Yes. Azura decides to take the reins once again. You are the only one powerful and influential enough to bring true advancement to Morrowind, to heal the people and the land. We will offer you no reward for this request, for it is a reward of its own. Should you manage what we ask, you will have the loyalty of your people, and your future will be much more secure. Which is, as you will no doubt find, the exact reason I have been preparing to go there. I just can't help myself sometimes. Our interests align, this is true. Azura nods, and while Mephala worded it as an optional objective, dealing with the issue of Red Mountain is not something you can ignore. Its fires are too powerful for even those born of its ashes to bear. Plans are already forming in my mind, but leave that for later. I trust I will have the support of your followers in this. Azura and Mephala nod, while Boethia hesitates briefly before joining them. Anyone truly devout to us will not impede you and will fight those that do. Excellent. I clap my hands and wait a moment to see if any of them were about to add anything. Seeing as they do not, I nod. That would be all, I trust. Remember to have fun, dear Tilda, Mephala sing-songs. I just grin and shake my head, slowly turning to leave. Dagoth, Azura's voice grasps my attention once again. The Daedra looked almost hesitant to say it, but she did, Mephala looking incredibly smug in turn. Considering my chosen's current absence, you may pursue a more firm form of unification. Well now? I can't help but be surprised by her tacit approval, so all I do is offer a respectful bow. I will keep the option on mind should it be the most expedient. My perceived disdain for her offer seems to miff her somewhat, but it is already too late, as I had begun to unravel the vision, and the last thing I heard before I returned fully to Nirn was Mephala's raucous laughter. Honestly, if I didn't know the three of them could be quite brutal and frankly outright evil. Sometimes the three of them would remind me of slightly more mature high school girls, high on some false idea of power they had. Not a bad description now that I think on it. I mutter as I decide I was too lazy to shuffle around my study table and simply shadow step into my armchair, summoning a cigar as I did and lighting it. Now then, I keep muttering where to start. It was then that I remembered I never actually bothered getting more information on current Morrowind affairs than was truly necessary, and by that I of course mean I knew its history and what a couple of the great houses were doing at the moment, and almost nothing beyond that. Scorch poofs into existence atop a nearby brazier, radiating disappointment. Seriously, Pops, what the fuck? Why didn't you remember it then? I fire back with a raised eyebrow. He tilts his head and rubs his right wing below his beak. Because it wasn't interesting at the time. Nodding sagely, I wave my hand at him, and there you go. So, Birdman trails off before chirping with excitement. We doing it live? Indeed, Scorch. I grin. We doing it live? We would have to be quick about it too, since there was still S at dollar and hash EM to deal with. Wait a fucking second. My brain buzzes for a moment before I feel the knowledge snap back into place. Future calamari recipe was already playing with my plans, and I didn't even notice. How excruciatingly terrifying. I did not even notice my grin widening to disturbing proportions at this point. And yet how incredibly exciting. Taking too much time would not be an option. Chapter 4, 115. Onwards to Resdain. In the end, coming up with an actionable plan, or at least something vaguely resembling one if you squinted real hard, wasn't even that difficult. I had the power, I had the prestige, and most importantly the wealth to pretty much walk in there without anyone being able to do a single thing. Mephala might be disappointed by what I suspect will be a subpar amount of scheming and general fuckery I might get up to. But she already got enough of that here. Hopefully she didn't fuck something up when I let her loose into the city. The echoing seductive giggle in the back of my head was not encouraging in the least. Shaking my head at the admittedly terrifying thought, I still knew that things could go wrong, so as usual a proper spy ring would need establishing, par for the course really. And not the small number of agents I had at the eastern edges of the province. Oh no, if I got my way, I was going to fully suborn the Morag Tong as quickly as I could. That would no doubt silence everyone with enough brain cells to rub together. And the rest of them, now that I think about it, only in a much more permanent fashion. If I wasn't made of literal fire, I'd be able to cut myself on just how edgy that was. Scorch's dry chirp come from within. I naturally ignored him. The caravan would be moving out later today, early enough to have time to reach the castle town of Chelman to the northeast of the city Isle before night came, and we had to camp up. And I'd have to actually follow them around for most of the time at least, mostly because people were still twitchy about the recent surge in danger, and my presence would reduce guard costs greatly. Annoying but understandable. But first, to actually settle matters here. And so that was how I found myself seated within my study a mere hour after leaving it, mug of steaming coffee in hand, and a quintet of vassals and one Akulakan in front of me. Right then, I speak to the non-mechanical part of the group after taking a sip of the delightfully bitter brew of the gods. As you know, I will be leaving Cyrodiil for a prolonged period of time. I sincerely hope none of you will be quite so foolish as to create issues while I am off gallivanting. We shall, as always, do only our best to serve. Alor is the first to speak as he notices the others hesitate. Though I doubt you have called us solely to tell us to behave, my lord. Maybe I have. I quirk an eyebrow, but do not bother continuing the jape. That aside, I wanted to make sure all of you gave me one final report, and to give you your tasks while I am gone. Seeing as you were the first, I might as well start with you, I go on, my eyes still focused on Alor. What is the state of the Swarnmer? The farmer hesitates, but only briefly, inclining his head in a mix of determination and barely hidden shame. The losers shook some of them, but as you told me, all of them knew to expect such things. There is some murmuring about getting reinforcements or outright recruiting while we remained stationed here, but morale is holding up after some rest and relaxation. Nothing out of the ordinary there. I nod and consider briefly. It will be your choice whether to call for reinforcements or recruit. You already have access to the stipend, so resources will not be an issue. He somehow manages to pale, but nods. Your task, I pause dramatically, will be to place your men and yourself at Minthara's disposal to accomplish any military task she deems necessary. Your secondary mission will be to act as my dignitary and diplomat, primarily with the nobility up to and including the Alinori, who I hear will be staying for a period. He outright balks this time. My lord, you are quite eloquent when you are not scared shitless. I cut him off with a light snort. You will represent me before the nobles, and thus train yourself up in both tasks. Aelor just stares for a long while before accepting his fate. As you command, my lord. Excellent. I clap my hands and turn to a somewhat bored-looking Dunmer. Idrasa, you are to mostly continue with experiments on Dwemercraft and expanding production. But I also noticed we have made no real contacts with the local academia of the non-magical variety. She suddenly turns a bit more interested, her mind quickly putting the pieces together. A rather wise choice, even if oddly late. One step at a time is the only explanation I give alongside a shrug. Aside from that, do make sure to aid the others whenever necessary. The rest is up to you. She accepts my command without a word, and seeing as she regularly gives me reports on what she does, I have no need to question her further. Jackal, I call. The masked Dunmer bows, my lord. You are already aware of all your tasks, and they are as always to remain between you and me. He nods. Is there anything requiring my attention now? The nobles are somewhat restless, but thoroughly cowed through either awe, loyalty, threats, or blackmail. He answers without missing a beat. The merchants are happy with trade, constantly increasing, and the guilds are mostly returning to business as usual, as they have no other choice. The dumb fuck at the head of the Fighters Guild barely avoided getting her head lopped off. I shake my head with disgust. Her lack of importance saved her life, yes. Jackal almost jokes. The only issue would be the Alinori and them attempting to extract advantages in their unenviable situation. But my brothers and I will be more than able to deal with it. As always, the woodsmen do good work. And I genuinely mean what I state as I give him a respectful nod. Eldor. I turn to the rising name in the market district, numbers still going up. He grins in his distinctly disturbing manner. Indeed, not counting the initial boom of noble purchases, our automata have started being bought up even by wealthy households and the like, even large freeholder farmers for hard labor. Constant growth, then? I quirk an eyebrow. He grins wider, not a single drop since the opening. Not much to say there beyond keep at it. He somehow makes his expression even worse, but Idrasa's disturbed look soon makes him school his face. Finally, I turn to the room's final living occupant, who does not even wait for me to speak up. I will be going with you, of course. My eyes narrow ever so slightly. Oh? I made an oath. Anondor simply states, not in any way forceful, but merely stating a fact. Besides, you going completely alone could be construed in many different ways by the native Dunmer. Akula Khan will be accompanying me, I point out, and so shall your shades. The snow elf's expression remains serene as he turns to the automaton. No offense to you, of course. You serve my master ably, for a meat bag, is all the automaton says in response. I lean back in my armchair, pushing it slightly off the floor as I leaned a bit too far, but obviously not falling due to simple telekinesis. A full minute passes before I let out a considering hum and allow the chair to return to its original position with a thunk. Fine. The paladin of Aruiel perks up at that, but I expect no complaints on whatever it is I choose to do. I add, there will be a lot of danger and exploring, I suspect, and I am not one to shirk such opportunities. All the more reason for me to accompany you. He smiles serenely. Right, I drawl. I wasn't truly against him following me around, and he made a good point about optics. Besides, it isn't like I wasn't going to flood the place with my own people at some point anyway. The excitement Boethia hinted at would no doubt give me the perfect excuse for it as well. That should be everything. I state after a bit more thought, you may all return to whatever it is you were doing before. Anondor, we head out in 4 hours. They all salute me in their own way and shuffle outside, leaving only the silent junior behind. My master, Akula Khan, speaks up. Should you really let the Pale One dictate what you should and should not do? Dictate? I quirk an eyebrow and shake my head. No. The automaton just stares. He made a suggestion at best. I explain he may have followed me from a distance anyway, but quite frankly that is his right, so long as he informs me he is leaving his task here. He isn't actually in my military. And he keeps staring. Not everyone needs to obey me at all times. I roll my eyes. That would be incredibly dull. He pauses for a while longer, making me think I would need to go deeper into this, but he does speak up in the end, as long as it entertains you, I suppose. I just shake my head. Kids sometimes. A few hours later, I had finished my preparations and was making my way to the caravan. Minthara and I had already said our goodbyes, but her band, which now returned from their job down south, did insist I at least share a drink with all of them. And while Lydia and Junior were mostly just polite, Marco requested I record everything that happens so he can get some free inspiration. Cheeky, but fair enough. The two blades, though, well, let us just say that they were still somewhat awkward about the whole me sleeping with their divinely ordained boss thing, but it was mostly just awkwardness, as they already knew I was their superior in all but name months ago anyway. Titus and his council, though, took a bit more time out of me. We went over all our short and long-term plans. I listed out any idea I could come up with, and the old emperor also took me to the side so we can discuss the future of the empire in truth. The conversation was a bit on the uncomfortable side, if I was a blushing teenager, that is, since it included topics like securing the succession and dynastic troubles. But since I failed to react like he expected, he just grumbled good-naturedly and wished me luck. And so, having just sent a bunch of commands to Davos to begin preparations for future moves, I found myself joining a downright massive caravan as we left the heart of the empire. The emperor himself made a short speech from atop the walls as we left, a large crowd gathering to send us off as the sun began slowly setting in the horizon. The caravan was, as I previously noted, rather massive, so massive in fact that it warranted mentioning twice. There were thousands of people, a good chunk of them of the Dunmeri variety, as many of them were interested in helping their homeland or outright wanted to resettle back. There were even a few hundred refugees from the first migration after the eruption of Red Mountain, all of them rather young when it happened 200 years ago, and now respected elders among the diaspora. We were accompanied by a cohort of light cavalry and an equal number of Fighters Guild members on contract. The cohort would follow us to the border, where a Redoran detachment would replace them, leading us to our final destination at Blacklight. Something told me that wouldn't be the case for me, but honestly, I would not have it any other way. We managed to reach Chalman by nightfall and continued the long march as soon as the sun began to rise. Numerous Dunmeri travelers performing minor rituals to Azura at dawn and dusk, as was tradition to the more faithful, while the rest merely pretended to care. Days passed and I began talking some of them up, when I wasn't spending the vast majority of my time orbing about or reading, that is. Most were at first surprised I even bothered wasting time with them, but after a while they opened up, and I began gathering information on what they knew and how they lived their lives. I grew bored within days, so bored in fact that I grew outright twitchy. By the time we reached the pass leading to Morrowind, the entire county of Cheydinhal had been thoroughly cleansed of bandits, goblins, ogres, and minotaurs. Yes, I was in fact that bored. The pass took us another full day to go through. It was long, it was narrow, it was rocky, and worst and most damning of all, completely unmaintained for divines know how long. Once more my twitchy arse did its thing, and I ended up using alteration to flatten widen the road for a full cart to pass along the entire length, or we would have spent 3 days instead of 1. Just as I was beginning to turn twitchy once more, I felt it. The air became warmer, it became drier. It smelt faintly of fire and tasted like ash. I breathed in as deeply as I could and felt my whole body thank me as it realized. We were home. Chapter 416, A Dry Welcome. Rejoice Soup enjoyers as yet another ascends up the ranks and unto eternal glory. The house gives thanks to Hakira for their most valiant effort in bolstering its might. May you remain as wise as the masses remain hungry. I stood in place for a long while, my eyes closed as I simply let myself drift in the oddly familiar feeling I never felt until now. It was something akin to Kyne's warm embrace, except much, much weaker and utterly constant. Letting out a short, satisfied exhale, my eyes blinked open, revealing the still fully armored visage of a Nondor. The paladin did not need to say anything. The question in his eyes was clear. Merely enjoying the air. Is what I said, unwilling to elaborate further. How close are we? He still looked a bit curious, but he was disciplined enough not to ask, dutifully giving his report. But a moment later, just under an hour or so, the caravan master said, he kept praising your work and the inevitable uptick in trade now that the road isn't liable to ruin one cart in three. Shaking my head with a light chuckle on my lips, I say, just imagine his reaction if he learned I did it all out of sheer boredom. Personally, I don't think he would mind it either way. The paladin points out reasonably. I shrug. The thought is still entertaining. We continued talking about nothing important for a while longer, helping to pass the time as the 5,000-strong caravan and its 1,000 guards trudged along the pristine roads left behind me. The constant channeling of magicka for a full day was quite pleasant after holding back for so long, and combined with the oddly welcoming air, my mood was thoroughly improved by now. Naturally, the world had to be an absolute fucking shit about it, and the moment we finally stepped out of the pass just north of Kraganmore, I got to actually see my ancestral homeland. And with my sight, I could see quite a lot. Abject fucking poverty. To be fair, this was the southernmost domain of the Redoran, just a bit north of the Black Marsh border, and raids were reportedly a constant near-yearly thing, so the area being impoverished wasn't that much of a real surprise. But that was not it. Even this far south, so very removed from the influence of the Red Mountain, the ashes still smothered a good part of the soil, not covered by errant forests or low hills, utterly ruining a massive chunk of the once good farmland and thus the rest of the economy. And this was the western part of Stonefalls to boot, a region once known as the oddly green part of Morrowind. I could only shake my head in dismay as I imagined just how bad things were on the coasts facing Vardenfell. So dismayed was I, in fact, that an idea started forming in my mind, the western winds, summoned by my thoughts only serving to guide my thoughts further, as the boldest of concepts came to me and was swiftly refined into a plan. Oh yes, I could work with this. General POV. North of the fortified city of Kraganmore, if the heavily depleted settlement could even be called that anymore, at the edge of the pass leading into Cyrodiil stood a weathered caravanserai. The building was large in general, but relatively small for its purpose. An inn, a stable for both gar and horse, and a low wall meant more to keep out wildlife than anything that could stand on two legs. It was in front of this weathered building, once a thriving domain of a Hlalu merchant branch, that a trio of figures stood waiting. One was an immensely tall specimen of their kind, clad in orichalc plates, further protected and embellished with chitin. He leaned on his glaive and allowed his thoughts to trail off. His barely shorter mirror, on the other hand, was pacing impatiently, turning to his older and larger brother with annoyance in his eyes. By the gods, Masur, you at least agree with me, right? The taller warrior slowly blinked his drowsiness away and turned to his little brother. What is the point, Masanor? What is the point? His brother scoffed and shook his head. We are wasting our time here, staring into the distance while there is actual work to be done. And only on the vague promises of some dumb kid priest at that. We are warriors of the Erebenimsun, not some Urshilaku soothsayers. Again, what is the point? Masur leaned his polearm on his shoulder. We are already here. The house elves already left half a day ago, and the kid sounds sure of himself. That is because I am certain of our path. The kneeling and meditating elf, clad in Indoril robes and uncaring for the ash sticking to them, spoke up. We need but be patient, and the gods will bring us deliverance. Patient, Masanor hisses. Anderethis burns, and you want me to be patient. I may be an Ashlander, but I have my pride, you up-jumped little. They come. The priest interrupted him without a hint of fear, pure conviction lacing his every word. Masana grit his teeth, but still gave the young one a chance, looking to the west even as the afternoon sun threatened to blind him. And there he saw a massive caravan and their equally large guard detail. The trio did not move for a while longer, and they did not need to, as they were noticed almost immediately by the detachment of Legion cavalry, who looked just about ready to go and surround them. Standard procedure in truth, but the two Ashlanders were not assured by this, not that they could do much to go against it. Thankfully for the two Erebenimsun warriors' nerves, the cavalry force stopped moving into wings and instead reformed around the caravan, all the while opening a path between them that let a trio of figures pass in turn. One was utterly massive, standing at over 4 meters tall and wearing what looked to be modified Dunmeri heavy armor, and wielding a grand glaive, a strip of long purple cloth, fluttering from where its pole met its blade. Masur whistled in appreciation at the sight. The weapon was obviously a masterwork. The second figure confused all three of the Dunmer, as they were clad in full armor of odd and unfamiliar make, obviously heavy by elven standards, and a masterwork at that, but bearing colors of white and gold that did not quite fit with any known band or house that could afford such. Masana was forced to begrudgingly approve of them, though, being the resident heavy armors expert, he was one of the rare people who could truly appreciate the quality of the white-clad elves, for it was certainly an elf equipment. The third figure needed no introductions, for their mere presence was enough for the scion of Indoril to know their name. The prophesied messenger of the true gods looked almost unnaturally immaculate as he approached, his eyes blazing with barely contained power. It was just too bad for the young Indoril that said divine messenger was not about to play to his expectations. Raven's POV. Now what do we have here? I rose an eyebrow at the two Ashlanders. And one Indoril, you don't look like a band of Redoran warriors, that much is certain. I do hope Archmaster Serrano didn't send you 3 instead of his kin. The shorter Ashlander scoffs, drawing the concerned eyes of his Indoril companion. And so what if he did, Devil Blood? Well now, I do not even need to give the command before the air behind me shifts and a Kulakan appears before the insolent little shit. Hag's bane poised to pierce right through his helmet's eye slit in an instant. On a side note, the fact that the taller Ashlander actually managed to react fast enough to only stop mid-swing, as what I presume was his kinsman was threatened with death, was quite praiseworthy in its own right. Well, well, well. I clap my hands with a dramatic slowness as I approach, Anondor following suit with sword drawn and shield ready to interpose himself in case of an attack. Some would call that kind of vitriol bold, but I personally feel rather inspired by the sheer fucking idiocy of it all. I take a step, and suddenly I am next to the completely still Ashlander. Tell me, little nomad too dumb to leave your dusty homeland, if I am this devil blood you mention, how is it in any way a reasonable idea to insult me? The Ashlander looked ready to deliver a rather scathing retort with appreciable spite in his eyes. The little priest had other ideas, however, as he immediately rose his arms placatingly. My lord, please forgive this fool. We have been waiting for your arrival for a long while now. He is merely distraught at the attack on our people to the south. Finally, some god's damned excitement. I grin and turn to the Indoril, explain. He hesitantly looks to the two Ashlanders and deciding to skip the begging, I simply give Junior a mental nudge and he blurs behind me, his weapon still tense. Thank you, my lord. The priest bows as the shorter Ashlander cautiously steps back. Indoril Verin, at your service. Dagoth Raven, but I am sure you already knew that. I drawl lazily. Some politeness was not remiss, even if rather needless in the current situation. Now you were saying something about an attack. The young elf chuckles a bit awkwardly at his, no doubt caused by his noble upbringing, segue. Apologies. He bows his head. The force of the Redoran Guard was present when we arrived some 7 days ago. But 5 days hence news reached us that the Argonians sacked the city of Anderethis and were making good time towards Kraganmore. The Redoran left almost immediately and has us stay behind to share the news. Well, she did say things would get fun, I mutter, while pretending to ponder things. And what did the news say of the enemy numbers? I doubt they were perfectly accurate, but they speculated some 6,000 Argonian warrior tribesmen. He shakes his head regretfully. It could be more and it could be less, but I have no way to confirm this. And the forces of the Redoran? I ask both the detachment and garrison of Kraganmore. There were 300 mer under the leadership of a house father. Verin explains, I have no idea of the garrison, but the city is too impoverished to afford nearly enough warriors to protect it from such numbers. Interesting. I hum and summon Scorch with a mental nudge, the dreaded birdman flying away without a word. I suppose cutting through some Argonians would be a rather fine first impression. Without waiting for the Indaril's response, I turn to the Ashlanders. I trust that the two of you will not be complete idiots about this. The shorter one goes to say something, but is promptly smacked by his taller kinsman, who shakes his head. Nothing at all, Sarah, so long as you take us with you, of course. That shouldn't be an issue. I nod and remain silent for a moment until the reason I summoned Scorch is made clear. Legate furious. Lord Dagoth, the Leowin-born cavalryman greets back, "Your bird mentioned new orders?" Yes, it would appear Black Marsh is not quite honouring their previous peace compacts. I inform him we both knew there were no such compacts. It was a truce at best. And I find myself in need of your services to help my kin. The Emperor was clear that we were to follow your lead. The legate does not even blink, surprising the trio of Dunmer. Just say the word and we will move out. Then consider my word said. I grin at him, have the Fighters Guild members fortify the caravanserai as a precaution. I pause and summon a bag of gold, tossing it at the horseman. In case the proprietor proves a bother. I will get right on that. Furious grins and directs his steed away. That was... Indaril looks genuinely baffled, fast. What? I snort. Did you expect I was just going to let the Argonians run wild? The shorter Ashlander actually keeps his mouth shut on his own for once. Well, the city is one of a rival house. The young priest states somewhat awkwardly. I just laugh. You will find, Indaril, that such things are rarely enough to bar me from my goals. If politics attempt to stop things from being done, then they are obviously bad politics. My grin is not a pretty one, and I don't tolerate such wastes of my time. Finally, you say something worthwhile. The short Ashlander scoffs, but approvingly this time. Oh, please stop, you are making me swoon. My voice is as dry as the Red Mountain as I look back to the caravan. The legate looks just about ready to move out. Come on then, follow me and you can inform me as to why you were here in the first place. The priest followed immediately, forcing his two companions to join him. How very nice of the farm tools to immediately hand me a just cause, why I might even not burn their cities to the ground in thanks. Chapter 417, Relieving Kraganmore. General POV. Veyrin of Great House Indoril, priest of Azura and rising star within his household, found himself rather confused as he marched faster than he ever thought reasonable, his small group trailing behind the trotting horses of the Legion cohort with only 2 pack guards between them. On the one hand, his quest in seeking the messenger of the gods was going quite well, as he managed to ingratiate himself sufficiently to follow along as Boethia's work was to be done. On the other hand, so she made a whole ass dramatic reveal and everything. Said messenger of the gods was currently laughing his ass off as Veyrin told him of the prophecy of Ald'Rune and the words of Azura. Good thing I noped straight out of that. A beat of silence passes. You... Veyrin's brain stopped for a moment. You noped out of it. Oh yeah, Lord Dagoth chuckles, as his 2 companions follow wordlessly. Dealing with prophecies is a chore, so I just told her I would do my own thing. Veyrin shared what he thought was a subtle look with the 2 Ashlanders, but neither Masur nor Massanor felt like butting into the straight-up smite-worthy blasphemy going on right now. By all the good Daedra, Veyrin could even feel his patron's consternation. Or at least a tiny part of him registered it as such. Raven's POV. Damn, trolling the starry-eyed little shit is too funny. Best give him some time to recover though, wouldn't want to break him too quickly, that just wouldn't be sporting of me. So anyway, what can you tell me about the state of Kraganmore? I pause. You do know something about our destination, right? It takes him a moment to gather himself, but he accepts the proposed shift of topic with almost manic eagerness. I know a bit about it, I suppose. He says somewhat apologetically. It used to be one of the greatest cities in Morrowind, the centre of agricultural trade at that, and rather famous for its plays as well. Idly I channeled a bit of magicka, riding a horse that was just about to stumble due to the shitty state of the road, the rattled legionary giving me quick thanks and now looking far, far more cautious about where he directed his mount. The Argonian uprising and subsequent invasion put a thorough stop to that, however. The priest went on, "It is a shadow of what it once was. The constant change of hands did not help either." Ah, I perk up a bit. I did hear about this one. Started as a Dres domain, turned to Hlalu, and is now under Redoran. Indeed, Vaerin nods, though the Dres held it for the greatest length of time. Ashin house politics. The shorter Ashlander, Masana spat out, "Too much time spent one-upping each other and too little actually doing things." I'd agree with you if what I guess is your actual point was not even dumber. I scoff, earning an immediate glare from him. The houses existing isn't a bad thing. Downright meritocratic by Tamrielic standards, actually. They just need a bit of guidance. Bah! He scoffs back. Of course a house elf would say that. For some reason the terminology he used really made me want to wring his neck. The third tagalong finally rejoined our conversation. My little brother's seething aside. That earns the big Ashlander an immediate flipped bird. You'd be right if not for every single house leader thinking themselves the right ones to offer this guidance you speak of. Point. I nod, surprising all of them. But it is still better than the utter decentralization of your tribes. You reach a certain population level, and retaining a simple system just isn't feasible anymore. Before our talks could continue, we crested a hill, and a vast plain greeted our eyes, or more accurately, the city dominating it. Large walls, numerous towers, and tall buildings. It was smaller than human cities, by a massive margin at that, but quite large by elven standards. And its smoking ruins, in progress, were currently completely surrounded by a bunch of tree-humping Argonian little shits whose hatred and desire to butcher everyone inside I could practically taste from all the way up here. One rapid scrying revealed Vaerin's information to be quite incorrect, as I counted only just under 2,000 lizards, not that it mattered since the garrison had taken quite a bit of attrition, and even with the Redoran reinforcements, it stood at 800 warriors tops, joined by about a dozen magi of around high adept and low expert levels. In short, they would get slaughtered in mere hours. And I just couldn't be having that right now, Legate. I called, my serious tone cutting through the air. "Sir," the horseman saluted, "prisoners are permitted." I told him as magicka began to bubble beneath my skin in vast rampaging torrents, "but let none escape." And in a blast of magic and thu'um, I was gone. General POV earlier. Almiril Farron, errant dragonslayer and recently promoted housefather of Great House Redoran, was genuinely wondering if the gods had it out for him. It all started when he returned triumphantly from the Battle of Skuldafn. He and his men garbed and armed in gifts of House Dagoth and towing carts of automatons behind them as they did. The Archmaster welcomed him with stoic approval and congratulated him on his dutiful choice to fight the apocalypse, his fellow councilmen unanimously voting for his promotion within mere days. He thought he would finally find some peace now that the most recent crisis was resolved. He should have known better. His connection to House Dagoth became known, and when it came time for the Redoran to receive the Lord Godslayer, guess who they sent to escort him? That is right, good old Almiril, who had just gotten his wife to forgive him for his dumbass swit decision to go attacking monsters like some foolish youth back when he was in Skyrim. He could still feel the furious slap he got for even thinking of accepting an entire month after the fact. But ever dutiful and only somewhat encouraged by his promotion, Almiril accepted his task nonetheless and marched with his newly enlarged retinue, the admiring looks of his new subordinates driving him mad with each day that passed. He was almost thankful when they received news of the Argonian raid. At least he could now vent his frustrations on a more than acceptable target. That was a few days ago, when his men were still fresh and the garrison wasn't running on fumes, and they were not surrounded with enough Argonians to drown them in their own blood. One thing one should understand about facing an army of Argonians is that they are infuriatingly difficult to put down. A human may bleed out if you manage to lacerate their throat, and an elf even faster than that. An Argonian, though, stab them through the neck and they still have good odds at surviving if they get the most basic of treatments within a full bloody hour. Their equipment may be terrible, consisting of mostly leather and bone for the armor and bone, obsidian, and only sometimes actual metal for the weapons. But they more than made up for it with their natural toughness and sheer numbers. Much like the group currently attempting to gut him, come to think of it. Blinking his tiredness away, Almiral jerked back as his honed reflexes screamed at him, narrowly evading the wild swing of a massive lizard man, and immediately retaliating with a precise stab through the Argonian's eye, killing him instantly. He did not fall back, however, and instead pressed forward, cutting off the arm of another lizard, currently attempting to disembowel one of his younger subordinates. Said elf, gathering enough courage to thrust forward with his glaive, and guided by more luck than skill, strike the Argonian in the throat. A spindly Dunmer behind his lines scoffed irritably as flames gathered in his hand. Bloody fucking noirs! He screeched, throwing the fireball straight into the group of Argonians and burning many of them alive in mere seconds. Not one to miss such an obvious opportunity, Almiral called out. Forward, finish them off. His fellows wasting only a few staggered seconds to follow after him as they began butchering the disoriented lizards. This went on for hours and hours, skilled elves barely holding off the much more physically capable lizard men, pushing through their lines even as they pillaged the city with reckless abandon. Almiral was quite glad he directed the civilians into a cluster of fortified towers that somewhat resembled a keep earlier that day. Them and all the supplies they could carry. Well, at least they may survive long enough for help to come. He found himself muttering, "You got another fireball in you, Sadras." The spindly elf coughed before forcing a magicka potion down his own throat. "Approaching my blood limit here, Redaran." Almiral couldn't help but chuckle at the scratchy voice of the mage. Another group of Argonians rounded at their section of the walls. He made certain that they had to pass him to get to the civilians, and he tensed for another fight, only for another mage bearing his house's colours to join them, followed by a dozen automatons mounted with repeating crossbows. The whole rank of lizard men fell in seconds. "Dreloth," Almiral sucked in a frustrated breath, "I ordered you to conserve the munitions for protecting the civilians, and I will accept any punishment later." The young mage breathed heavily. "But the civilians will be much better served if you survive as long as possible." Tisk! The Redaran veteran couldn't really retort as the nearby Sadras mage began to laugh at him, the mirth soon turning into another round of coughs as he barely held the swill of magic potions down. His unit, some 50 or so elves serving as the front line, managed to rest up for 3 entire minutes before they heard marching from both their front and their left, soon joined by their right. Almiral, almost as panicked as his followers, quickly looked to the stairwells he ordered destroyed, only to find them just as he wanted them. So why are they coming even now? He got his answer swiftly enough as he saw throngs of lizard men coming from both sides of the walls, a massive specimen sauntering atop it just outside of his force's range and glaring at him. The obvious Anzilil member grinned with far too sharp teeth as he beheld the exhausted force of the slavers. "Greetings, elf." He hissed, his massive hands gripping at his warhammer. "How does it feel to be on the hopeless side?" Almiral held back a quip of his own and merely straightened his back, his followers doing much the same as they began forming up for battle. But the Argonian's grin just widened in response as metal hooks with ropes attached to them rose from both sides of the wall, those lizards below the wall already beginning to scale them. And much to the Redaran's dismay, they did not bother limiting their new assault on just his area. The whole length of the wall surrounding the civilian towers had been surrounded, the automaton munitions and that of his few archers disappearing within minutes as hundreds of lizards fell, only for more than half of them to be dragged away for healing. "Yes," the Anzilil agent hissed, his forked tongue slithering across his lipless mouth. "Now there is a look I can appreciate." Almiral made a prayer to Boethia, feeling a surge of certainty within himself, and readied his blade. Only for the entire battlefield to go utterly quiet all of a sudden, as a wave of what the crass would describe as pants-shitting terror covered the whole city of Kraganmore. The Argonian's eyes dilated, his limbs and those of his followers behind him shaking uncontrollably as some deep-seated instinct within the Argonians screamed at them to flee and not look back. Almiral's arms were shaking as well, thought not from terror. In fact, all of him was shaking as he finally failed to contain his laughter, as he realized he could recognize the imposed feeling of fear. The ancestral lizard only had a moment to narrow his eyes in confusion before a streak of black fell from the skies and passed straight through the 100 or so Argonians in front of the Redoran contingent, leaving naught but red mist behind, and revealing an armored and robed elf holding the massive lizard man in one hand as he squeezed the life out of the suddenly skinless creature. Almiral's shoulders sagged in relief. He had managed to hold out. Chapter 418. Clearing out the vermin. Raven's POV. Tearing through the poor fuckers was as easy as breathing at this point. I didn't even need to bring out the fire, merely mentally grab every single bit of metal they had on them and pull, focusing most of my magic on the leader as his gloating offended me something fierce. So much so that I even slowed time just to instill as much terror into the little shit as possible. Now, I growl as I grab at the bloody piece of meat. How about you, Ter? I pause as I realize he wasn't even twitching. With a scoff of irritation, I tossed the limp body aside, tumbling it onto the throngs of lizards below. Fucker died from shock. Divining some quick tactical information, I summoned Surge into my right hand and began channeling my magicka into a massive spell. My time in Cyrodiil was not wasted on idling, part of it anyway, and I spent many sleepless nights working on my large-scale spells in preparation for the inevitable clash with the Thalmor. And now I just got a few thousand volunteers for some good old field testing. Feeling almost all of my magicka, a good 10,000 units worth, gathered in the massive runic array above me. In just above a short 2 seconds, I grinned in satisfaction and with my free hand pulled. General POV. Almiril Farron was not a mage, not even close. Even after decades of trying the best he could do without specialized equipment, was summon a small flame fit more for a campfire than actual battle. Most of his magicka sense coming more from sheer instinct than anything actually palpable. It was rather baffling to him then that when what he knew for certain was Lord Dagoth cast his spell, he actually felt it for the first time in his life, the Sadras mage beside him gasping for air all of a sudden, all but confirming he wasn't hallucinating. He did not have much time to consider the implications, though, as whatever the Lord Godslayer was doing finished, and what looked to be a vortex of fire appeared hundreds of meters above him, crackling crimson fire at that. In an instant, the vortex unraveled, sending hundreds upon hundreds of bolts of searing flame across the entirety of Kraganmore, the short screams of the Argonians lasting for but a split second before they were unmade. A small part of Almiril was quite grateful that his helm hid his face, for he would have never been able to live it down if his subordinates saw him gape as much as he did at that moment. The mere thought of the shame was enough to shake him back into focus as he began slapping his warriors awake and bellowing out orders. For all the arcane might of their rescuer, there were still hundreds of lizardmen dispersed within the city, and clearing them out was something the warriors of Redoran were more than capable of doing. Raven's POV. Could use some tweaking. I tisk as I feel, more than see the Redoran guard rushing towards the remaining groups of lizards. The legionary cohort outside the gates doing their best to cordon any potential paths of retreat, as the veteran legate quickly reacted to the shift on the battlefield. Probably a Great War veteran then, if he could react faster than an elf. Deciding that my part in all this was done, chasing down peons was simply not worth my time, I approached the hunched figure of the high adept mage, clutching at his stomach with pain visible in his eyes. Hunched over as he was, the elf bearing the heraldry of what I vaguely recognized was Great House Sadras. He still managed to offer a deep bow. My thanks for the timely rescue, Archmage. It is no trouble. I wave him away, unsummoning my crown and making him gape at just how young I looked. You need any help? If you could, that would be much appreciated, he croaks out. A quick scan quickly reveals he was suffering a heavy potion overdose, and while I could heal him enough that he would still be able to function, his magic would be fucked for a month at least. Oh well, nothing for it then. I blur into place before him and simply punch him in the stomach, sending vibrations through his whole body as he finally failed to keep the liquids down. doubling over and throwing up a veritable sea of dirty blue on the bloodied walls. "Nchow!" He curses as he hacks out a cough, my ensuing restoration spells calming him down somewhat. "Thank you," he forces out. "That came dangerously close to killing you." I point out, best just get it all out. He stops glaring for a moment and nods a couple of times. Probably right. Once more he offers a bow, Sadras Regnild, house cousin. Just as I am about to introduce myself, his eyes widen as he finally manages to get a good look at my own heraldry, a mix of fear and awe now hidden behind his pained look. A bit amused, I introduce myself anyway. Dagoth Raven, Great Lord. "An honor," he says neutrally, a dry chuckle on his lips. "So you are the one Feren has been hoping would bail our collective asses out. Not sure if I should consider us lucky or cursed. I am a blessing to whomever meets me." I grin happily, completely unbothered by the screams, begging for mercy, the denial of the same, and other miscellaneous noises around us. Why, I think I may even choose to inspire a dream or six. He pales, though impressively, doesn't so much as twitch. "Please tell me you are fucking with me." I just keep smiling at him. "No, I don't think I will." The Sadras looks halfway through, either running away or simply ignoring my words, and being at least a bit wise, he swiftly chooses the latter. "Come on then." I wave for him to follow as I start walking to the south of the city. There is a bit of resistance this way, and I am curious to see how they do. He doesn't seem too tempted to ask who I was referring to. A few minutes later, we approach a large bastion tower, now occupied by a bunch of Argonians, desperately trying to hold off the Akolakan's blurring form as he rips them apart with either glaive or fist, Anondor dutifully warding away any potential blow and retaliating with swift precision, born of centuries of practical experience. But I already expected them to do well, so my gaze was drawn elsewhere. Almost in a lesser mirror of my own little band, the two Ashlanders and the Indoril hew through the Argonians with appreciable skill and power. The big Erebenimsun tribesman crushing through their light armor with each swing, while his shorter brother struck with both sword and shield, breaking bone and stabbing through gaps and weaknesses. With each movement, the priest quickly healing them and preventing each mistake from turning into a liability. It takes them only minutes before the 30 or so lizards are cut down to the last, the final one uselessly crawling away as Junior simply stepped on his spine, granting him an agonizing death. Now, while I may have given permission for prisoners to the legionaries earlier, that did not mean I preferred them. The worst part about my levels of clairvoyance was the ability to see everything around me, and on a battlefield, one could not afford filtering out any information above a certain level. Which meant I got a perfect look at the damage done to the city and, more importantly, its inhabitants. The Redoran did a good job retreating them to the northern bastions, but there was no way in hell they managed to get everyone, and the results were not pretty. Not at all. The trio I invited along quickly surveyed the area around them, saw me looking at them with amusement, and promptly plopped their exhausted asses on the clearest bits of the wall, the two Ashlanders grumbling all along, while the priest was giving me a look of unmistakable religious validation. Ugh, I could practically taste Azura's amusement. Anondor and Junior were far less unprofessional, however, and the two of them quickly fell in behind me, the ensouled automaton completely ignoring Sadras, while Anondor gave him a speculative look. I saw the cordon around the city finally close, and the legionaries begin hunting down any escaping groups of uppity lizards, but still, better safe than sorry, so I gave the whole place one more burst of powerful sight beyond sight, and quickly realized one of the little shits managed to escape. "Well now," I tut, drawing immediate attention from everyone as Scorch formed atop my shoulder and leapt away in the slimy little shit's direction. "That just won't do." General POV. Aladar Sin ran like his life depended on it, his lungs contracting and expanding rapidly as he forced more and more air into them to the point of nearly making them crack. A feat not naturally survivable by non-Argonians and greatly draining even for the marshfolk. He covered leagues in his mad dash south, the news of enemy reinforcement too important to be lost, even if his band fell to buy him time for it. The Hist would honor their sacrifice, this was known. The edges of his sight began to dim, telling him that he was slowly approaching his limits and would soon begin to falter. He thanked the hist, for he calculated it would be enough. Or it would have been. A sudden pain assailed his shoulders, and he looked up in a panic to see a massive flaming bird clutching at him and carrying him into the skies, its trajectory turning northwards even as the Argonian in its grip struggled uselessly against his imprisonment. Aladar Sin could have sworn the bird spoke to him in mockery, but he could truthfully not say at that moment, for his mind was both exhausted and terrified as he realized he was brought to the city of the slavers and knew his fate was grim. The hist would prevail in the end, he consoled himself. Even he was brought before the thing that posed as an elf, its cruel smile telling him exactly what would happen now. He prepared himself to resist, but apparently the creature had no intentions of speaking to him, as he suddenly felt something scratching at his mind. Colors assaulted his senses before solidifying into one terrifying sea of red, so much red, drowning him, tearing him apart, unmaking him. Raven's POV. Well, that is interesting. I mutter a bit of annoyance in my voice as the Argonian's eyes melt and I manage to dredge the last bit of information from his literal lizard brain, far more resistant than I expected. Almirel stiffens slightly, his immediate guess probably hitting quite close. What is Seryo? He and a good number of his officers, alongside the legate and everyone else of note, had joined me in the city hall of Kraganmore. The Redaran thanking me profusely and assuring me the Archmaster will honor my house without question for saving an entire city. The rest of those I had yet to introduce myself to were a bit more hesitant to even interact with me. But when a literal force of nature, very humble I know, stands before you, you can't really say no. Now can you? I scratch my goatee, my eyes staring south. That was just the scouting party. A moment of silence passes before the Redaran veteran begins belting out every single curse the Dunmeri language holds, and then proceeds to invent new ones just for the occasion, utterly terrifying his younger subordinates and coming up with such filth. Some of it made even me blanch a bit. Well, good luck with that, Sadras says simply and gets up from his seat, already heading out towards his freshly recuperated band of caravan guards, the same fellows that accompanied him even as they all got stuck in the siege to begin with. I am going to grab my men and retreat before this whole place turns into a hellhole. I just appear before him in a twist of shadows, a grim understanding already forming on his face. I am afraid all capable hands are getting conscripted for this one Sadras, no exceptions. His face turns sour. Respectfully, you have no authority over me, Lord Dagoth. My eyebrow raises. He stares. My eyebrow raises further. He spits on the ground and goes to join Almirel in his cursing, the two then proceeding to cooperate into bringing more delightfully filthy curses into the world. Honestly, at this point, if they managed to bard an actually magical curse into existence, I wouldn't even be surprised. We just need a Telvanni and a Dres, and we have ourselves a full party. I mutter as I scratch my goatee, suddenly pausing. Now, why do I feel a sense of foreboding at that idea? Chapter 419. Logistics and Summons. 3 hours had passed since the two Dunmeri nobles managed to stop cursing their souls out and got to work bringing order back to the city, their remaining troops helping the civilians clean the place up, while what little logistical staff they had brought went about setting up everyone with a warm meal. The people looked stressed, but not overly so. The city of Kraganmore was used to raids like these, even if not in nearly the same numbers, with many of the citizens being at least somewhat trained in combat. And by that I mean the barest of basics of training by elven standards. That Almirel had them stay in reserve in case he fell both impressed and mildly irritated me. Guess I spent way too much time around Nords, most of whom would rather charge into a hail of arrows while half naked instead of sitting out the defense of their own home. Cultural differences aside, a good 7,000 citizens still lived, a rather uncomfortable number when compared to its previous state as just under 9,000, but not nearly as bad as it could have been without my intervention. Our military forces, on the other hand, well, they still existed. The Redaran kept a strong garrison in the Stonefalls at all times. the vast majority of whom were stationed at Andrethis, the same city that reportedly got sacked mere days ago, yes. As for Kraganmore, the previous garrison of 500 professionals, also reinforced by 300 retinue-level fighters and another 200 Sadras mercenaries of variable quality, up to and including mages, was now thoroughly battered at a weak 700 strong. A downright excellent showing against what was originally nearly 5,000 Argonians, but still devastating for any real counterattack. It was a good thing then that Legate Furious barely lost a dozen men, and most of those were only maimed instead of outright killed, a problem I easily fixed. I found it quite funny how most of their actual issues came from the very common rocky outcroppings and uneven ground fucking with their horses and making it hard to maneuver instead of the literal invading army of lizard men. My statistical musings were interrupted by a quartet of steps, the 3 house elves and legionary joining myself and my guards. Legate, I say without turning, my eyes still staring south. My lords. The Indoril Redaran Sadras trio seem a bit flummoxed by my form of address and hesitate to respond. A bit of a shift in my mannerisms, more than enough to stun them, however briefly. Sir, Furious, having no such compunctions, salutes. The surroundings of the city have been pacified, and as you ordered, we had any elves still hiding out in the hills retreated to the city. They weren't troubled by the fact you were legion. My eyebrow raises, even if I still refuse to turn. At first, Furious scoffs, but the priest boy here settled that. I hear the grin in his voice as he taps the Indoril on the shoulder, nearly doubling him over. I nod along numbers, just under 1,500. The legate answers simply. Almeril too adds, that should be most of them, though I admit I did not have much time to go through the local census logs before the siege took all of my attention. We will just have to hope those that managed to evade us will manage the same with any raiding party. I shrug, the results were already good anyway. How are the troops? Furious answers first, his enthusiasm clear, eager and ready for another sally. Sadras is next, still sounding a bit reticent of his recruitment. They are grumbling, but the promise of loot and dead Argonians will settle them, for now. Almeril speaks up last. My own forces are battered to the extreme, but now that they had the time to heal and get a bit of rest, their hearts burn for vengeance, even if I recommend a day or 2 more rest. He hesitates before speaking further. We have no confirmation of Andrethis, but no force of this size could have gone through without ravaging it first. My scrying spell ends. It is quite dead, I assure you. I finally turn, revealing the slowly receding glow in my eyes. The fort and everyone in it, all 2,000 warriors and the accompanying 500 support staff. Feeling a bit miffed by it all, I add, they managed to hold out in their keep for a full 6 days. Likely part of the reason so little of the Argonian host managed to besiege Kraganmore. Furious makes the sign of Arche, Sadras hisses, Indoril bows his head, and the Redaran, well, his face turns utterly stony, not a hint of emotion to be seen to mundane eyes, but an absolute torrent of fury to those who knew how to see. The elf who fought dragons with no hesitation straightens his back, the fires of vengeance practically burning in his eyes as he asks a simple question, orders. The 2 other Great House members give him bewildered looks, but I ignore them and turn to Furious. No raiding parties are near us, so you are to return to the caravan. A third of the supplies meant for Blacklight are to be redirected here alongside any volunteers willing to settle. The Fighters Guild mercenaries are to be offered triple rates if they accept taking over guard duty while the rest of us are at it. After that is done, your light cavalry is to be our scouting force until further notice. The legate doesn't question, merely salutes and marches off. Sadras, I address the second elf who merely grunts in response. How many magi are there in the city? He hesitates for a moment before grumbling a bit to himself. A dozen or so, barely worth the title of adept at that. Seeing my outright dismissive look, he quickly adds, my own magi are quite a bit more battle-trained, even if our sole-ordained expert got herself swarmed to death by suicidal lizards. He spits on the round. Now that may actually be worth something. Any who willingly join us will be given lessons by myself. I offer, drawing a look of immediate greed from him. And who knows what other rewards might await if they prove they are not complete cowards and failures. I will round them up. He pointedly doesn't grunt this time. Lesson from an actual archmage will probably make even the laziest of the little shits get their backsides moving. Finally, I turn to Faren Redoran. He salutes. This city has been under your house for around 2 centuries, yes? 215 years. He responds simply. I hum in a vaguely approving manner. Would it be safe to say that your house culture has at least been somewhat accepted within the populace? Beside the obvious border militancy, that is. He nods indeed. Good. I allow myself a smirk. Round up at least 1,000 of them, more if you feel it wise, and start drilling them in long spear formations. I will transmute some simple weapons and armor for them as well. That should give us a nice core to hold the enemy while the rest of us do the killing. He considers briefly and nods. I will be sure to get them up to passable standards before we march, though I will caution against relying on them overmuch. They may learn to stab well, but discipline is not something grown in mere days. So instead of discipline, we will have to instill morale. I mutter, drawing a noise of agreement from the soldier. I will see what I can do about that once they are at least a bit rested and recovered. And Amaral seems to agree. Probably wise in the long run. They are Dunmer. They will be ready for the counterattack. Hearing the unasked question, I answer, we won't be able to move for a week at the very least. The city needs to be fortified further. Supplies need to be organized, and I need to write some letters. Letters? The Redoran frowns. To whom? Why, the other great houses, of course. I grin at him. Speaking of, Indoril, you look like you know your way around a bit of house politics. You will be helping me with this. The young elf bows. Of course. Anondor Akulakan. And oh boy, were there some winces at that name. You can help the Redoran with the training while I am busy. General POV, minor time skip. All around the many capitals of Morrowind's great houses, whispers began to spread of a fiery bird diving into the various council chambers, delivering both disdainful mockery and terrible news with each visit. Mere days passed before anyone worth anything learned of a growing southern incursion threatening to swallow beloved Resdane whole. Whether said incursion was of House de Goth, the Yansi Leal, or uppity slaves was a matter of opinion, however. Upon the island of Old Ebonheart, just north of House Dre's sole remaining domain of worth, the Grand Magnate. Aneris Drez scowled furiously at the letter now sitting at her table, the heat, both verbal and literal, of its deliverer still fresh in the back of her head. The relatively young house leader knew that the sender, a rather notoriously ascending name these days, would gain great influence if he was heeded. But at the same time, her domain and the last of her house's power base was basically a stone's throw from the Stonefalls, and would most certainly be ravaged in the case of defeat. With a sigh of defeat, the leader of House Dre called for her retainers. She had an army to prepare. Within the city of Necrom, the grand ascendant of House Indoril held a serene smile as the bearer of flames left him, not even bothering to look at the message before incinerating it on the spot. If the supposed messenger of the good Daedra was to prove himself, helping him out overmuch would be a terrible disservice. Indoril Neramir nodded at his own logic and turned to his drink cabinet. Drinking himself into oblivion was far more important than some far-off war after all. Sadras Sindril. Househead of the new, by elf standards, Great House Sadras stared at the letter in her hands, her amusement at the messenger bird's mannerisms more than enough to make her actually read it instead of hoisting the job at one of her clerks. She began skimming it before stopping and doing it once more, but much more thoroughly, her cheerful expression growing paler and paler with each second as the request /bribe/threat hidden within the call for aid became apparent. Most would have missed the subtext, but the 300-year-old woman knew better than to ignore the 6 branches are stronger together than separate allegory held within. All who refused would get a visit from the woodsman, was her takeaway. Well, she chuckled, much less entertained this time, at least he isn't asking me to do it for free. Here is to hoping she won't be held accountable for Dagon Fell being so far off the front. What is it, you imbecile? Can't you see I am working? Baladas Demnavani hissed at his apprentice. The Archmagister of the Telvanni had come this close to breaking through Dagoth's formula of metal direction, only to be interrupted by this chit. First he is forced into leading this excuse for a house, then he has to move to Port Telvanis, and now this dumb idiot child gets hoisted onto him as a favor. Why he shoot? 1,000 apologies, my lord, the poor girl bowed. An urgent letter just arrived. Then give it to the mouths, you fool. The elder Dunmer threw his arms up. Did I not tell you to bother me with this shit 1,000 times over? But my lord, no more excuses, fool. Why, I will have you. Master, the woman yells, making him pause due to sheer surprise. If anything, the Argonians are invading and Lord Dagoth has sent for aid. Well, why didn't you say so? Baladas scowls and starts grabbing his combat equipment from all over, all the while muttering something about finally wringing the truth out of him. Master, the apprentice hesitates. He rounds on her. What? What am I to do with this? She lifts the letter. He almost did forget about it, didn't he? Shaking his head, Baladas spoke. Send a message to every single master and magister. Tell them the animals are acting up again. Archmaster Varan Serrano skimmed the letter he just got thrown at him and grunted in annoyance. He tossed the letter at his closest subordinate and gave a simple order. Make ready the host. Raven's POV. Without even looking up from my students, I ignore the sudden crack as Akulakan grabs a fucking shadow scale that just tried to skewer me and got her. Neck broken for the trouble. I am afraid that will be all for today's class. I smile happily at the rows of half-dead students who had just spent the past 4 hours expending every single bit of their magicka without knocking themselves out. It would seem our visitors are making their move. Chapter 420. Opening Clashes, Part 1. They were said to be extinct, Viren Indoril mutters as he shuffles after me. His reserves were trained well enough that he didn't end half comatose after my lesson. To think a shadow scale would appear so openly and die like a complete failure. Regnild Sadras scoffs in disgust. These things were supposed to be nightmares. I doubt it was meant to be a decapitating strike. Anondor points out clinically, this was at best a recruit who saw an opportunity to take out the exhausted magi. A foolish choice in the presence of Lord Dagoth, which says a lot about their inexperience. Definitely a weakling, must have mistaken me for just another mage as well, which is just sad. I nod, my examination of the corpse done, and toss it into my oblivion storage. Had some very powerful poisons on her, though. How powerful exactly? Anondor narrows his eyes. Would kill everyone here except me and you in mere seconds. I shrug, ignoring Indoril's self-assured nod and Sadra's shiver of fear. Anondor's stare softens. Good? What do you mean good? Sadras barks out, still a bit terrified. My job is to protect my lord. The Falmer shrugs without a care. Why would his assured survival not be good? Gone unsaid was that he would sacrifice either of them to protect me in an instant. Indoril nods in open approval while Sadras just scoffs, unable to gainsay him one whit. It is quite troubling, though. Veyrin mutters after a bit, the resurrection of that order is going to make things difficult. They wouldn't be lacking in recruits in any case. I point out, shadow scales are just Argonians born under the sign of the shadow and tossed to the Dark Brotherhood for training. I do not bother hiding the disgust in my voice. Since I personally made sure that particular order is dead, they likely had to recreate it on their own, which would explain the ineptitude. That, or they never died out in the first place. Regnild counters gravely, sending out a full order of assassins to face the Telvanni without a backup plan sounds incredibly unwise. And say what you will about the Anzi Leel, but one does not storm both Oblivion and Morrowind in the same decade without some wisdom to them, as counterintuitive as that sounds. It is no matter. I raise a hand to forestall the conversation. I have counters to the shadow-loving lizards on their way as we speak. One has already arrived, in fact, But I do not say that aloud. Just as Regnild is about to question me further, we arrive at our destination, the city square turned training grounds. Almiril really went out of his way in the few days I gave him to get everyone up to speed, as instead of the 1,000 recruits I requested there now stood a solid 3,000 dark elves. They were even thrusting their weapons and marching about with the barest shadow of skill to boot. Thoughts of inevitable casualties aside, all of them were armed with a long but not quite pike-length spear, a solid steel breastplate, and a kettle helmet to guard them from falling arrows. Courtesy of yours, truly transmuting downright unreasonable amounts of metal in one sitting, of course. Not the ideal setup, but since keeping themselves limited to said armor was not the requirement, a good number of them managed to get their hands on chainmail, padding, all kinds of arm protection, and a very small number even had some ancestral equipment of far better quality. Hell, most of them were wearing 2 or 3 robes or tunics atop each other under the breastplate, which would protect them from most glancing blows, which would raise survival rates considerably. The caravan reinforcements arrived recently as well, so we had people manning the walls and the rest helping with repairs, speeding the whole thing up by quite a bit. The fighters were offered a place in the army, but the vast majority of them refused, citing their apolitical status or some similar bullshit. How low had the order fallen? Anyway, all in all, it was an acceptable citizen militia, even if some of the Redaran grumbled at the inevitable wave of recruits after this. It was the good kind of grumble, though. They may have to pay them and feed them, but skilled warriors were always welcome in the house, and blooded ones doubly so. Sir, Almiril salutes as we approach. The recruitment and training proceeds apace. A shame we are limited in time. These elves aren't half bad once someone threatens their home. Out of curiosity, I turn to the sea of bodies. How much progress could you make in theory? If we were given a week more to prepare, Almiril ponders aloud, I could have them whipped up to the barest recruit standards. Ambitious, I hum in a vaguely approving manner. They already went through basic training, so that helps. He shrugs, barely keeping the pride out of his voice, but I doubt we will be given that much leeway. True. I nod along. If the Argonians fail to attack soon, their element of surprise will be fully lost, and while it would be absolutely hilarious if they chose to humiliate me by making me out as a massive liar for calling everyone to arms, I doubt that is their goal. Don't give them ideas, Dagoth. Regnild chortles harshly. You'd like that, wouldn't you? I turn to him with a raised eyebrow. Hey, you are the one that conscripted me. He shrugs. I got the right to be angry about it. I snort, fair enough. The surprise on his face was quite satisfying. I am troubled, Redaran says after a bit. I turn my gaze in his direction and wave for him to go on. The Argonians. He turns his own eyes vaguely southwards. There have been no reports of them storming the east of Morrowind, only the Redaran Stonefells, and if the legate's words are to be believed, they are gathering more forces there by the day. A few thousand march in every day, yes. I confirm. They were gathering for something big, and if we did not start challenging them, things would turn unfortunate. Don't you find that odd? He asks simply. Redaran's dominion is known to everyone. It is Sadras who points this out. They could be trying to divide and conquer, hoping the other houses do not react, or at least that they do not react in time. Indoril looks distinctly uncomfortable for whatever reason. He did tell me his househead was a fucking incompetent, or at least he revealed it to me on accident. Oh well, war first, cleaning my backyard second. The Indoril domain is quite difficult to traverse. The priest tries lamely. Regnild Sadras scoffs. Most of your house are cowards, plain and simple, earning himself immediate outrage from the priest and raised eyebrows from both me and Almiril. But he ignores it all admirably. As for the Dress, who are the closest to us, they are still recovering from the previous invasion. The Argonians probably don't even view them as a credible threat, vengeance or not. So they want to face the Redaran at their best. I quirk an eyebrow, an unusual choice but not completely idiotic. You think they are doing it wrong? Sadras asks, seemingly genuinely interested. They have more than enough numbers to cross the entire border at once. I shrug. Even if it may unify the great houses into working together, it would still stall any potential reinforcements indefinitely. But it would also drain their resources faster, Sadras adds. Point. I give him a nod. Veyrin cuts in. Maybe the Anzai-Leel are looking for a decisive victory to spur the rest of them into action. It could be that their authority is not as absolute as we may believe. Not even the Thalmor's authority is absolute. I scoff, drawing a grumbling agreement from Sadra, who was turning out to be the more canny of the lot. But I doubt we will find out standing around here and pondering. Speaking of, just then the good legate rides up to us, his horse breathing a bit more heavily than usual, but not to the point of exhaustion. He does not bother dismounting and merely salutes instead. Sir, 3 parties have set out from their camp, around 3,000 each. Their goal, I ask. Large-scale foraging is my first thought. The Imperial says could be that they are trying to cut off the surrounding roadways, but frankly the terrain is too open for that to truly work. It could stop a fast response force quite handily. I point out after a moment of thought, even with how resilient most Gars are, they still need roads for rapid travel. That and Dunmeri cavalry was shit, plain and simple. As you say, sir. He accepts it easily enough. I cut my chin in thought, how close are they to each other, and their destinations as well? If my boys aren't completely wrong, there would be some 30 minutes march between each of them. He says after a bit of staring at a scrawled map. Margin of error, I ask. We are Legion Light Cavalry. He says with pride. This is literally our job. Yes, I wave him off. You are very smart. He scoffs but doesn't seem to be truly offended by my sarcasm. This is troubling. Redoran frowns. Even if the Dres chose to come to our aid, they would need those roads. Which is why we are going to clean them out. I grin, drawing surprised looks from all of them. And besides, what better way to blood our fresh troops than leading them in a defeat in detail? Redoran looked downright terrifying when he realized what I was getting at. General POV. Zashizar scowled as he marched through the dry Morrowind air. How the slavers could ever live in places with so little water baffled him. Another mark against the ill-born creatures is what he concluded, as he always did. Stop hissing so loudly, fool. His clutch brother hissed, at him. Your gurgling is making me regret coming here. And miss avenging our people? Zashizar grinned at him with a bit cheerful grin. His clutch brother gave him a bored look by guarding an empty road. The war chief told us that if we held this road, we'd contribute a lot. Zashizar shrugs. And personally, I prefer sitting around instead of storming walls. Let the mushroom guzzlers throw themselves at arrows. I will happily survive and get the glory. So very brave, Claw Leader. His brother hisses a laugh. Anyway, our kin have set up watch already. You have any other orders before we start settling in? The leader of the northernmost party of Argonians ponders briefly before nodding to himself. You know that carcass we brought along? His brother nods. Hoist it up, might scare the slavers into retreating. His brother grins. Ravens, POV. What about prisoners, sir? The legate asks me as we observe the growing camp from our position behind a small mushroom forest. No, I answer simply, as I observe an impaled Dunmer woman strung up in the middle of the road. Thankfully quite dead before she was impaled, I think not. General POV. Mayor of Kraganmore, Almaril Faran calls out as they stop their march. Ready yourselves. The Argonians in the camp were already scrambling for their weapons and preparing for battle as they saw the force of Dunmer approach. It would be too late. The army of the Stonefalls readied their spears. They were hesitant, afraid, bitter at the perceived abandonment by the more elite forces, but the sight of the Redoran noble leading them made them hold all of it back, and they marched. As soon as they passed a certain distance, arrows began flying out of the camp, but the few magi who managed to get themselves up for the battle batted them away with spells of wind that were by now thoroughly drilled into their heads, leaving only a few projectiles to bounce harmlessly off of simple but effective steel armor. The lizards were no cowards, though, and soon they began readying a charge, the biggest and most armored Argonians grabbing two-handed weapons and drinking some kind of sap before throwing themselves forward in a mad rush. "Hold!" Almeril barked over the loud roars of the lizard men. "Don't let them take one step forward." Elves were far lighter and weaker than Argonians, that much was known, but they were also far thinner, which allowed for incredible formation density. A formation that now looked more like a hedgehog than a group of people, as thousands of spears were pointed at the enemy and braced against the ground. The first lines clashed thunderously, lizards roaring in pain as they impaled themselves on far more spears than they expected. The elves suffered as well, massive weights suddenly slamming them into their comrades behind them, dazing them or outright knocking a few out as the formation began to buckle, only for the same magi who protected them from enemy arrows to summon balls of flame and slam them into the enemy front line, causing a bit of friendly fire, but not to the point of outright killing anyone, as Dunmer were very fire-resistant. With a simple barked order, the wounded were dragged behind the formation while fresh elves took their position. Another yell from the Redarin had them marching forward, spears no longer braced but couched to strike at the enemy, an enemy whose charge was stopped in its tracks by a sudden wall of fire and the bodies of their larger kin. The Argonians still tried fighting. They were not cowards, nor were they weak. However, bravery did not win battles, it merely permitted one to participate in the first place. And while the loose formations, light armor, and heavy weapons served the lizards quite well in most cases, it did not fare well against a literal wall of spears. A wall that was advancing forward step by step, slowed to a crawl due to stumbling over corpses and general lack of discipline, but still moving forward nonetheless. By the time the leader of the Argonians saw where the winds were blowing and began ordering a fighting retreat to their sister unit, it was already far, far too late. He only got to blow his war horn, both to alert his allies and order his people, before a shimmer of magic appeared in a close-by mushroom forest. A shimmer revealing a fresh unit of cavalry, all of them wearing legionary light armor and bearing spears good enough for charging. And as if that was not enough, at their head was a massive horse bearing an elf taller than most they ever saw. In his hand a long glaive, practically bursting with power to anyone with the sense to perceive it. Zashizar had only a few moments to realize just how fucked he was before the wall of horses and spears slammed into the side of his formation, slaughtering his kin by the hundreds. The last thing he saw was a pair of glowing red eyes as his torso was detonated in a burst of crimson lightning. South of the battle, within yet another cluster of mushrooms, the Redarin regulars waited patiently. No words were said until a war horn sounded to their north, and no words followed it as the career warriors prepared themselves for an ambush. The two Ashlanders shared a look, silently admitting that there may just be something to this whole great house business after all.